Well, hello there. I'm just going to go ahead and unmute myself so we can start. It is 9:05, and I'm sure folks are going to be trickling in. For those of you who don't know me, I am Catherine Leonard, Arizona State Historic Preservation Officer. And for those who are just tuning in, what we are going to be doing today is hearing talks from a series of distinguished panelists relating to the topic of uncovering and celebrating LGBTQ2S+. And if you're like me, you are staying tuned to find out what exactly 2S+ is referring to. So we are going to be looking at how do we identify, evaluate, and preserve properties of gay and lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, and the 2S+ heritage here in Arizona. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that we here at the State Historic Preservation Office and Arizona Preservation Foundation are referring to as Preservation in Place webinars. The concept of preservation in place emerged during the pandemic. Well, we are in the pandemic, but during the early stages of the pandemic in 2020, when we were in the midst of planning for our standard statewide preservation conference in June. It became very apparent soon in the spring of 2020 that we were not all going to be able to meet in person as we are wont to do annually to talk about the burning issues that are driving the field of historic preservation forward. But we wanted to somehow stay all connected, and we wanted to bring folks together in a dialogue that wasn't just a dialogue about Arizona-specific issues, but that really engaged those of us who are around the country. So in other words, we wanted to take the pandemic as an opportunity to expand our horizons, invite folks from the national field into our private spaces here in Arizona, our homes, but also engage in this very public dialogue about what is worthy of preservation. As 2020 developed, the field of preservation itself started to engage in a dialogue about what is historic preservation. Is historic preservation serving all groups, all Americans alike? And if not, how can we take a deep, hard look at what we are doing in the field and rectify that? So the Preservation in Place webinar series really morphed into a long-term series over the course of 2020 and 2021 where we tackled these issues. We looked at Black heritage in Arizona, we looked at the heritage of other underrepresented communities, and this particular installment has been planned for, I want to say the group has been planning for several months now, looking at what is the state of our knowledge of LGBTQ history and preservation in Arizona, and what can we learn from folks that have been doing this work nationwide. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the screen over to my colleague, Jim McPherson, President of the Arizona Preservation Foundation, so he can provide a proper welcome and introduction of our speakers. Take it away, Jim.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. I'm Jim McPherson, Volunteer Board President of the Arizona Preservation Foundation, our statewide historic preservation advocacy group. It's been great to partner with Catherine and her team on this Arizona Preservation webinar series. This is our 5th webinar since August of 2020. With a mix of local, regional, and national speakers, we've discussed the challenges of preserving African-American spaces, focusing on the Dunbar Pavilion in Tucson. We've examined the role of diversity and inclusion in Arizona's archaeology profession, and we've inquired about how to empower communities of color to identify and preserve their own stories. Around this time last year, I'm wearing red, we offered suggestions on how rural downtowns could plan for the holiday season in the throes of a global pandemic. I'm guessing those same ideas could be used this year as well. Special thanks to our webinars planning committee, Alicia Adolph, Connie Gutierrez, Margaret Hangen, Donna Reiner, and Eric Vondi. They, Catherine, and I welcome your ideas for future webinar topics. Just drop a note in the chat box when something pops up in your head. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Marshall Shore, Arizona's hip historian. Marshall is a friend and colleague on a number of historic preservation and neighborhood revitalization projects. Through pre-pandemic live presentations and tours, and currently happy hours and podcasts, Marshall has brought history to life for thousands in our valley. Now, through his work with the Arizona LGBT plus History Project, the National Museum of LGBT Culture and History, and this trailblazing webinar, there's more history to uncover and celebrate. Marshall, start it off.
All right, so can people see me? I've clicked on my video.
We can see you, Marshall.
Okay, perfect. Okay, very good. So good morning. I am so happy that you've all joined us today. Now, as Catherine was talking about, oops. So really, this is from our own SHPO website. Historic preservation is the identification, management, protection of tangible elements from the past for future generations. It is that history that we can see and experience. We move into the future with the explosion of new technologies. History preservation provides an anchor to our past. So, you know, I thought it was, I love doing things like this as we get a chance to kind of talk about how do we preserve history and places. Luckily, in New York, we have the Stonewall Inn, which was the first place dedicated for the LGBTQ community as a national monument. Now, a lot of times people think, oh, you know, those big cities, that's the only place where this history of raids, of community activism, of people just gathering happened not in just those big cities. It was across the country. And so that was kind of the fun of just kind of putting this together, was my own home state going on and finding the National Trust did a series of Indianapolis LGBT landmarks back in 2016. So this was an amazing chance to stroll down memory lane, seeing some bars or other organizations that had moved locations, but still being able to keep tabs on kind of what they were doing, or was the building now vacant? Kind of seeing my youth there on a computer screen was quite interesting. Now, as more and more places are doing rainbow crosswalks, here in Arizona, I know of 3, would love to see more of them, but I think it's also important not to just market, here's a walkway that says, hey, we are LGBTQ friendly, but what does that actually mean? It's like in both cases for here in Phoenix, we have one on 7th Avenue, which is kind of what people would call now the gayborhood. That is kind of the epicenter of where the bars are, as well as you now have people who are now moving to that district because it is the gayborhood. But before that, we actually had one that was downtown that was never really specified as a gayborhood. And that is basically Portland and Central, the one on the bottom left. And so I always like to, when we do tours, talking about the LGBTQ2 history of Phoenix, is using a marker, then going on and explaining, well, why is it here? And so sometimes you're able to do that because the buildings exist. Sometimes it is more just that the story is there. A little bit further down on Roosevelt, you'll wind up finding a plaque commemorating the 307, which, as far as I know, is the only plaque in Arizona commemorating an LGBTQ space. And sadly, we lost this in about 2015. I know Carolyn's going to talk a little bit about this, so I don't want to go too much in depth into this. But really, the demolition of one of the earliest bars that we can locate in Arizona, when that was demolished, it actually cauterized a group to say, hey, our history is quickly disappearing. And that is how the Arizona LGBT plus History Project formed. Is a collaboration with Phoenix Pride, ASU Libraries, which has the BJ Budd archives, and myself. And so really, in unison, we all try to acquire materials, ephemera, stories, and through ASU, preserving those and figuring out how to make those public accessible. Now, one of, I think, the interesting things in terms of when we talk about LGBTQ history is so often when you look at it, you're looking at mainstream press. here in Arizona, we really start seeing LGBTQ press by the community, for the community, back in the mid-70s, with a newspaper, the first one being The Observer, which was out of Tucson, followed then by Phoenix Pride, and then Sunday's Child, that was written by B.J. Budd, who the AESU archives are named for. And so ASU has digitized a slew of these. They're in the process of trying to figure out how to make them public accessible 24/7, which I think will be a huge boon to finding stories, more people, as well as even locations where LGBT community gathered, held events. We did one event with bar owners, and they created a list at that point of 120 bars just in the Phoenix area since the 30s, 40s. And so we know that this is at least probably about 40 more off, as some bars would change names for a short period of time, then go on to something else. And so look forward to trying to create some sort of an overlay so that we can really start looking at where the community was, where is it going, kind of seeing the migration of that, as well as just capturing some of the stories, because so many people are tied to one particular bar. I mean, I know a couple of them, even though the bar no longer exists, there are community groups that still gather to celebrate the community that was formed in oh so many of these spaces. With doing all of this, started putting together a program through Arizona Humanities that is exploring and just letting people know what history do we currently know of in Arizona for the LGBT community, as well as the goal is we've shared some history with you. Now, what stories do you have? Because that's really, there are so many stories that we know we're missing. There are some stories that we know are just lost through the sands of time. I'm involved with the Pioneer Cemetery in downtown Phoenix. And when we were first forming the LGBT plus history project, walked into a board meeting, said, hey, here's what I'm doing. And there wasn't much discussion, but then about a year later, got a note saying somebody had been doing some work in another cemetery and came across a really unique story. And that story would be Nikolai Duralyn. So Nikolai is a 1906 Russian gender pioneer. When Nikolai moved from Russia, he wound up landing in Chicago, got himself married, got a good government job, got divorced, got married again, contracted tuberculosis. And like so many people back in the day, Arizona was a mecca for those folks looking for dry and clean air. And so he moved to Arizona. Now he was of some means, so he actually lived. So when he moved here, he was living in a rooming house that he actually paid to have a separate bathroom installed. Now he also traveled with his own physician. Now when Nikolai did pass away a few months later, as they were ready for burial, they discovered that Nikolai was a woman. So that story went viral across the globe, from Bisbee, Arizona to Australia, above the fold front page. And everybody was wondering, how did this happen? Who knew? It's quite an intriguing story. And so when I found his gravesite, what struck me was that there was no headstone. I learned that upon his burial, he had been buried in a dressing gown. And so working with the community to take his grave plot from looking like this, where there is nothing, there is now a headstone. Working with local community members and actually some folks in San Francisco as well, to make sure that the headstone was true to who Nikolai was. And we held a variety of events In fact, one of them, the Arizona Republic, picked up, did a great article on, that also got carried by USA Today. Now, when that happened, I had a gentleman who had been working on a book about Nikolai reach out to me. It was just about to go to publishing, so we were able to get a photo of the headstone into the book. It is a book all in Russian. It is also the first book about a trans person written in Russian. Now, what was really cool about all of this was working with ASU, with Cronkite School of Journalism, a student project. We went around the valley and various places and just talked about history. One of them we did was Greenwood Cemetery and talking about Nikolai. And they showed it a few times here on PBS Channel 8. And then the next thing I know, I get a note saying we have been nominated for a student Emmy through the Rocky Mountain Emmys. And just last month, we learned that indeed, not just nominated, but that this project actually won an Emmy for sharing LGBTQ history right here in Arizona, which I think is pretty amazing. Now, working with those partners, when we were looking at the headstone, we worked with such folks as Transspectrum, also the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive, and really taking that and saying, well, what's next? And so we created a trans timeline of Arizona history, actually working with the Arizona Historical Society. So it is a 6-panel kind of roving, movable exhibit that we can set up anywhere. I'm actually right now talking about a local bar, having it set up there and just talking about that. So we unveiled it back in 2019, back in Bisbee. It was most recently at Phoenix Pride, which happened in November. So it was great being able to share stories and also letting people know that we're looking for more, because there's always more to the story. Now, one of the things I love about doing this type of thing is, you know, at Phoenix Pride, I ran into Miss Millie. So Miss Millie moved to Arizona in the early 70s. She was a transgender pioneer. She has written a book about herself. And one of the coolest things is it's been out of print for quite a number of years. And running into her at Pride, she is going to put it back in publication because she's like, well, you know, now people actually want to know more about LGBTQ history. Now, one of the caveats is because Miss Millie has been having issues with technology. We've not been able to get her involved with some of the storytelling events that we've been doing. Looking forward to a time where we can correct that. We also, back in 2019, Arizona held its first Two-Spirit powwow down at South Mountain Community College. And I hear they're planning on one for next year as well. So looking forward to that, celebrating our Indigenous communities and those people that live either currently or historically outside of gender norms. Also this year, we lost Rusty Warren, who was a Phoenix, not native, but she moved here in the early 50s. She is now considered by the Library of Congress as the birth mother of the sexual revolution. She just passed away at the age of 91. So kind of my current joke. So her big song that helped garner her the title of birth mother of the sexual revolution was a song called Knockers Up, done in the early 60s. And so kind of my joke now is that we now need a bust of Rusty Warren somewhere in Phoenix to commemorate her and the work she did, being a comedian and musician with a very pro-female stance. Several years ago, there became a building, what you see is the Enterprise, that was originally a Polynesian Dairy Queen. And it was up for demolition, going to be destroyed. Looking into it further, discovered that it was designed by James Salter, who had designed some of the most iconic buildings that no longer stand in Phoenix or Arizona. But he was a very out proud gay man in the 60s. That iconic facade has been saved and will be used on another location. So it'll be interesting to see how are we able to commemorate James Salter and his work. And then we also have Monica Helms. So Monica Helms is a military retiree. She was on a submarine. She also designed the trans flag right in Phoenix back in 1999. That original flag now sits in the Smithsonian. And she just sent me about 2 weeks ago she found the address of the apartment she was in when they designed the trans flag that has now been seen across the globe. So there are so many more stories. If you would like more information on events or other things that are happening across Arizona, you can keep tabs of us on Facebook, which is AZ Gay History, Instagram AZ Gay History, or email me at hello@hiphistorian. So without any further ado, I will pass things on to Carolyn Evans. I know it'll be a great presentation from her. So thank you all so much for being here.
Hello, and good morning. I want to thank everyone so much for being here, and thank you to Marshall for that introduction. I also want to briefly thank the Arizona Preservation Foundation for making this webinar happen today. So I would like to talk today both about the preservation of sites in Arizona and about the way we mark or memorialize them. And before I get started, if everyone could just use the little emoji tool at the bottom to go ahead and shoot me a thumbs up if you can see the slides and you can hear me. Perfect. Seeing a series of thumbs up. I'd like to begin today with a picture of an advertisement for the 307 in the new Pride. I'll include several news clippings throughout the presentation today, all of which come from the Pride and can be accessed through ASU's BJ Budd Memorial Archives, which Marshall was just talking about. The 307's claim to fame was being arguably the oldest gay bar in the city of Phoenix, and it has quite a long and extensive history. On this slide here, you can see a map of all the gay bars and bookstores in Phoenix as of March 1977. Number 3 on the list, and I'll use my cursor right here, is the 307 Lounge, which is located on this little block here. As this picture indicates, Phoenix had, historically speaking, more gay bars than you might expect. Of course, it's hard to pinpoint exactly which bars opened when and for how long, and what happened to each. But the advertisement and maps from gay press of the time, as well as oral history projects over the last few years, have begun the labor of reconstructing that timeline. My understanding of the history of the bar scene in Phoenix is that you can trace it back to locations like Roy's Buffet in the 1930s, which later rebranded itself as the 307 Buffet, a nod to its location at 307 East Roosevelt Street. When it moved to 222 East Roosevelt Street, sometime between the 1950s and 1970s, the bar kept the 307 part, now going by the 307 Lounge. Looking at this map here, we can see the 307's location in a neighborhood called the Fruit Loop, a small-scale prototypical neighborhood stretching from Roosevelt to Portland between 1st and 3rd Streets. Beyond maps, we can also get a good sense of the 307 by looking at schedules of bar specials and events, like this clipping from the Pride of Arizona in June 1979. You can see that the 307 must have been a tequila joint because they served a lot of tequila in their specials, but they also had this very interesting special as well, offering a free drink before noon on Saturdays. This is a good place to emphasize that while gay bars were bars, so you can expect some level of drinking, dancing, and social camaraderie in their history, they were also political spaces. There was something deeply political and radical at this time about gays and lesbians simply gathering and finding community. But what's the preservation significance of the bar? In other words, why was it important? There are a few answers to this. For one, the legacy of the 307 is one of gay community and all of its messiness. Here, I've included some clippings from the gossip column from the Mouth of the Dragon. Here, the eponymous dragon lady teases the 307 and its owner. So you can see right here, and right here as well. I find these passages to be deeply emotional because they help me imagine how community gathered and lived during this time. But the 307 was also connected to the community's history of protest, activism, and violence. Consider this clip from September 1978. After a shooting had left 2 bartenders dead, police had begun busting the 307 regularly, supposedly in the name of protection. The heightened tensions between community members and police prompted a formal meeting between leadership of the Citizens for Constitutional Rights, or CCR, and the Phoenix Police Department. Police violence at the 307 and community responses to it are also significant for the history of gay rights activism in Phoenix. But third and finally, the 307 really created a reputation for itself as a drag bar. Many of Arizona's most well-known drag performers, people like Pussy LaHoot, Tish Tanner, and Miss Ebony, performed at the 307. And while I am not a scholar in the history of drag, oral history projects have provided some insight into the political and social importance of drag in Phoenix. An interlocutor explained to AZ Central in 2019 that Stonewall helped spark a greater respect for drag queens in Arizona because it was well known that queens, quote, were basically the ones that put the fight up at Stonewall, end quote. And though whiteness certainly was a defining element in these bar spaces, the drag scene in Phoenix did include notable queens of color, like the aforementioned Miss Ebony. Clearly, the 307 was an important site for LGBT history in Arizona. But unfortunately, its history and prestige couldn't save the 307 Lounge from the forces of development. Citing problems with the utilities, hostile city attitudes, and a promising new location, the owners of the 307 first shut their doors in 2000 under the guise of moving. There was a promise that the bar would reopen, but it never did. The old building briefly housed other businesses, including an art gallery and boutique, but eventually it was purchased by real estate developers who planned to demolish the building in order to construct a new luxury apartment complex. There was an initial pushback against the demolition plans, as a Change.org petition received over 1,600 signatures, and a local urban awareness collaborative even drafted an alternative plan for adaptive reuse. But even with pleas about the storied history of the bar, as well as a series of priceless de Grazia murals, the real estate company ultimately forged forward with plans demolishing the building in 2015. But juxtaposed to this tremendous loss was an interesting coda of hope. As a result of the demolition, in 2015, a group of activists and organizations, Marshall Shore among them, joined forces with the BJ Budd Memorial Archives and Phoenix Pride to start the Arizona LGBT+ History Project, a collaboration meant to document and preserve LGBTQ life in Arizona. The organization's first goal was to erect a plaque where the 307 once stood. In 2017, a plaque was placed at 222 East Roosevelt Street, just outside the new luxury complex. The 307 plaque was the first of several LGBTQ heritage efforts coordinated through the Arizona LGBT+ History Project since 2015. The effort to memorialize the 307 was significant and it should be applauded, but it also raises a series of questions about how to address future projects. So this is a photograph I took of the plaque, the first or second time I visited it in 2019. The first pressing question that arises from this story is exactly how to memorialize these spaces and also perhaps for who. Given everything I've told you about the 307, its character, its essence, the description of the bar on this plaque can feel a little sanitized. Unfortunately, LGBTQ monument efforts in Phoenix must continue to navigate the complexity of making LGBTQ history palatable for all audiences, including those who may at first be unsupportive. With these considerations in mind, the 307 marker feels strategic. By use of the language of safe space rather than drag bar, the plaque transforms elements of the bar's history that could be perceived as deviant. The plaque also centers a nameless, faceless idea of a safe space rather than outing staff, performers, or patrons of the bar. Though the plaque itself does not identify the 307 as a drag bar, the Arizona LGBT Plus History Project virtual walking tour includes both names of performers as well as a discussion about the importance of drag. So to passerbys unfamiliar with the 307, the plaque hardly invites controversy. But for those attempting to learn more about LGBTQ history, the plaque is a valuable starting point into more nuanced discussions. Such choices are a good example of the delicate balance preservationists must strike in future monument efforts. But let's back up a little bit. So here's an image of the plaque a few feet away. Beyond this issue of how to memorialize spaces, there's also several challenges regarding visibility or even logistics. Perhaps the most basic of these is the deceptively simple question, what counts as an LGBTQ monument? The number of LGBTQ monuments in the United States itself remains somewhat of a question. Defining queer monuments as, quote, a heritage site that is officially dedicated to gender and sexual minorities, end quote, a 2018 article from the Journal of Homosexuality identified a total of 46 queer monuments around the world, with about a dozen of those sites located in the United States. If an LGBTQ monument is defined only as a federally recognized heritage site with direct LGBTQ language, there are currently no LGBTQ monuments in Phoenix. However, when the definition of monument is expanded to include publicly funded historical markers, public art, or even informal memorials, the number is much higher. Under this wider definition, as you just saw, Phoenix is home to at least 5 LGBTQ monuments, including the 307 plaque, Nikolai Duralyn's rave marker, 2 rainbow crosswalks, and an LED lit dress memorial. To my knowledge, these smaller, locally based memorial efforts have received mostly positive feedback. One of the things that I argue in my research is that these historical markers, public art, and informal memorial are especially attractive strategies for Phoenix because they allow so much flexibility and choice. Rather than relying on city, state, or federal guidelines, preservationists in Phoenix can choose to work alone, with community organizations, or with university partners in identifying and dedicating sites for LGBTQ monument and memorial. It's very community-based. And regarding funding, they could choose to bypass city government and work with local business or private partners to secure funding. And considering the landscape of Phoenix has been so heavily decimated by perpetual development, the creation of new focal points like plaques or public art can help reinscribe those stories into the built environment. This is quite literally what happened with the 307. It was the real estate company, Barron Properties, which donated the plaque you see here, and the plaque projects the history of the 307 into this space, even absent the old building. But here's a third image of the plaque, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. And from this distance, it can be hard to see, but it is kind of right over here. Here, I want to again emphasize the dedication of the plaque represents a monumental, no pun intended, step forward. But my experience in visiting the plaque has also left me wanting more, like more monuments for starters, and bigger monuments, bolder monuments. We're probably still a ways away, though, from an installation in Wesley Bolin Plaza. But in Arizona, where local LGBTQ history remains still very largely hidden, additional monuments will play an important role in generating community knowledge and support. Because monuments are added into the built environment, they invite both LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ audiences to engage this history. An increase in LGBTQ monuments can play a vital role in encouraging more Arizonans to engage with local LGBTQ history. And the addition of new monuments can also begin to move the needle forward on representation. As more audiences become familiar with the history of drag queens or gay bars as sites of community or activism, monuments to these spaces may feel less risky or invite greater support. Put simply, Arizona needs more LGBTQ monuments and memorials. But looking at this small plaque juxtaposed to the looming high-rise, the allocation of space makes me wish that the memorial wasn't needed, that the building was still there or integrated into the new construction or better preserved in some way. But perhaps that's my biggest want of all, for future sites to avoid a similar fate. Unfortunately, the preservation of LGBTQ historical sites raises even more challenges than LGBTQ monument and memorial. To understand the challenges in saving a building like the 307, it helps to have some national context. The commemoration of the 307 comes at an exciting moment in national LGBTQ historic preservation efforts. The last 10 years have seen a surge in support for both heritage and monument projects as reflected in the 2016 National Park Service theme study, LGBTQ America, which identified numerous sites of national LGBTQ importance. On the one hand, the rising national interest in LGBTQ preservation, as reflected by the theme study, bodes well for Phoenix, as it may lend legitimacy to future local LGBTQ heritage efforts. But on the other hand, even with these important attitudinal and administrative shifts, the actual preservation of sites remains difficult for many reasons, including the ephemeral nature of LGBTQ spaces, a lack of capital in many LGBTQ communities, and the recency of the gay rights movement. National Register of Historic Place, NRHP guidelines have proved especially troublesome for LGBTQ properties to even meet the criteria. There's also a continued stigma around these types of sites that can prompt preservationists to either strategically omit LGBTQ connections during the NRHP application process or decenter that history, lest it spark unwanted community backlash. For this reason, of the nearly 94,000 sites on the National Register of Historic Places, only about a dozen or so are included due to their primary association with LGBTQ history. For what it's worth, there is an effort now to address this underrepresentation. The National Park Service is both encouraging new nominations to include relevant LGBTQ history and encouraging properties already on the NRHP with unrecognized LGBTQ history to go through the amendment process to make that history visible. So while this represents an exciting direction for the future, I sometimes find myself wondering, had these strategies been around just 10 years earlier, would the 307 still be standing today? After all, it was the original building, it maintained a significance of over 50 years, and it had a connection to the history of art due to the de Grazia murals, all components of which would have made for a compelling application to be included on the National Register of Historic Places. The future of LGBTQ heritage and preservation efforts feels so exciting, but as this example demonstrates, it's hard not to feel remorseful for the history seemingly lost, or at least to feel a bit behind. But in some ways, this is the bittersweet legacy of the 307. The demolition was preventable and a tragic failure for Arizona history. But in the wake of such a loss, an LGBTQ historic preservation movement started in Phoenix. And the loss of this important historic landmark has galvanized a wave of support for future LGBTQ preservation efforts. And here you'll see some clippings from the Arizona LGBT+ History Project website, the State Press at ASU, and the AZ Republic. In the last 6 to 7 years, LGBTQ historic preservation efforts have become quite rich here in Phoenix. And you've seen some of those already from Marshall speaking earlier. All of these efforts were sparked and came after the demolition of the 307. It's true that preservationists, historians, activists, and community members in Arizona are dealing with a very different preservation situation than that of a New York or San Francisco. But Arizona does have the two necessary preconditions to build an impressive preservation infrastructure. One, Arizona does have gay history, and lots of it. And two, Arizona has people who deeply care about that history and are willing to invest time and effort in making it more visible. So even if these efforts remain relatively thin on the ground right now or are only in their infancy, there is potential for these types of projects to grow and flourish in Phoenix in the future. But where does that leave us right now? While the efforts of preservationists, historians, activists, and community members should be applauded, Phoenix remains vulnerable. This is a clipping from December of 1979, when beloved gay bar Casa de Roma was closing. The first lines of the article begin, quote, "Bulldozing landmarks is not an uncommon occurrence in our fair city of Phoenix. Relics of the past collapse like houses of cards in the path of progress, turning into instant parking lots. It happens all the time, and usually without fanfare, without notice. And so it went with the old dame of Phoenix's gay bars," end quote. This clip has shocking relevance in the present. I think it's worth revisiting these clipped passages as a reminder that our history has been at risk of demolition while it was still being created. The strategy for historic preservation is 40 years overdue. And when we wait, when the pace of development moves faster than the pace of preservation, history is lost. Phoenix is experiencing a wave of development that makes it likely demolition will continue in historic neighborhoods. Thus, preservationists must envision the goals of LGBTQ history projects as twofold: memorializing properties that have already been destroyed and saving properties facing imminent destruction. Luckily, and as I'm sure other speakers today will note, there are many ways preservationists, historians, and activists can educate, train, and invite the larger community to participate in LGBTQ historic preservation efforts. There are so many possibilities, and while we have a tall preservation task, it is hardly one that is insurmountable if we work together. So that is my segment of the panel today. I'm going to stop sharing, and I will now turn it over to the next speaker, Marcus Brooks.
Thank you, Carolyn. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? I don't, okay, perfect.
Yes,
all right, thank
perfect.
you. All right, so I'm giving my presentation today titled Augustus Granville Deal, Recovering and Retelling Mismanaged Black Queer Histories. Sorry. I want to first thank the Arizona Preservation Foundation for putting together this webinar and inviting me to speak on this panel along with my esteemed peers. Because my training is in sociology, not history. But I think that what our disciplines share is a recognition that public knowledge and history are projects constantly in the making. And as we see a revitalization in attempts to claim a narrative about US history by those who would be antagonistic to the kinds of histories discussed here today, I'm thankful that we have the space to talk about those histories that have been hidden and pushed to the fringes, and discuss how those histories can and should be recovered and preserved, and how those recovered histories can help shape a future built on an understanding of the past, which considers the breadth of human experience. And just a note on my use of the word queer in my talk today. In the little existing literature that already exists out there on Augustus Dill, he's labeled as gay, and recognizing that conceptions and labels of sexuality are not static, and also recognizing that, to my knowledge, he never described himself as gay. I choose the term queer to talk about him. What we know is that he was a lifelong bachelor. I think queer provides a more descriptive label about what we about things we actually know about him, rather than gay, which would be ascribing a label to his identity that he may not have taken on for himself. So, in the spirit of thinking about neglected histories, I'd like to start with this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, a founding father of American sociology and mentor and colleague of Augustus Granville Dill. And it reads, "There are scattered and forgotten nooks and corners throughout the land, Negroes of some considerable training, of high minds and high motives, who are unknown to their fellows, who exert far too little influence." And it's my hope that in recovering and preserving and presenting these histories, that queer people's perspectives will exert a little more influence in today and in the future. So in previous talks on this work, I usually focus on my research findings and analysis, but given the venue today, I'm going to talk more about the research process and then get into some biographic points and how they correct existing narratives at the end. This research has been deeply personal for me and to me, and I have taken great care to try and offer an honest and respectful but holistic history of A.G. Dill. So the idea for this project first came to me in 2018 when I was in my second year in my program and in a graduate seminar about the sociology of W.E.B. Du Bois. And in the third week of the seminar, we read a paper from the instructor and one of my mentors, Earl Wright II, entitled Beyond W.E.B. Du Bois, a note on some of the little known members of the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. And the importance of this piece and its position within a larger field of work is beyond what I'm going to talk about today. But what's important to note is that this piece sits alongside a larger set of historical literature, which over the past several decades has worked to canonize Du Bois's work within sociology, himself having been excluded for half a century. This paper, Beyond Du Bois, highlights the broader academic infrastructure and co-researchers who worked alongside Du Bois at Atlanta University at the beginning of the 20th century. The point of this paper is to recognize those who worked alongside Du Bois and to correct the emerging narratives that he was a solitary scholar, when in fact he worked with a community of scholars and researchers and activists. So this paper highlights some of those people who otherwise have been lost under the long shadow that Du Bois has over the history of Black people in my discipline. During class conversation, Dr. Wright mentioned that he wanted to continue this work and mentioned Augustus Dill, a gay man who worked with Du Bois. Hearing this, I perked up, and having a research paper due for the course, I decided that I would take this project on. But not knowing what I was getting into as someone who is not a trained historian, I ran into several issues very early on. First, there just wasn't a lot of information available, and a lot of it was conflicting, especially dates, degrees, certain narratives about his personal relations and things like that. So there didn't even seem to be clarity on who this person was in photos. So one of my primary resources early on was Google. And these are the pictures that at different times during the research process, Google had shown for him. The problem is that neither of these are Dill. On the left, there is Rudolph Dunbar, conductor, and on the right, the writer Langston Hughes, who I'll actually talk about a little bit later. So at this point, I didn't know much, and I didn't even know what he looked like. So I had some websites that focus on Kentucky history, queer history, Southern history, and Black history, all with brief biographies. And then there's also a sparse Wikipedia page and mentions of him in some of Du Bois's biographies. Another major problem I ran into that I didn't realize was a problem right away was that there were several books that I thought he might be in based on what I knew up to that point. But when I searched the index of these books, he wasn't listed. And you can see an example here. This is where book previews on Google and Amazon and the Internet Library came in handy, because I was able to search all or most of these texts and found him discussed in these, but always, or almost always, either in terms of his arrest in 1928, which I'll touch on in a minute, or as an aside in discussions about Du Bois. And as I mentioned earlier, Du Bois casts a large shadow, and I was seeing firsthand how Dill's history was subsumed under his mentor, to the point that his contributions weren't even index worthy in these texts, even though, as you can see, he is discussed within the body of the text. So as I started to assemble bits of information here and there, I found that just about every one of them referenced back to one text, this book, The Harlem Renaissance, from Bruce Kellner, published in 1984. And this historical dictionary really set the template for how Dill was presented in every other text I found about him. And his life story is pretty consistently summed up in these texts in three ways. First, he graduated with a degree in sociology from Harvard and worked at Atlanta University. Second, in about 1910, he moved to New York to work as the business manager for The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP. And in 1928, he was arrested in a gay sex sting in a New York bathroom and subsequently fired. But what struck me about this biographical narrative is how abruptly it ends, with some writers even arguing that Dill languished in obscurity for the rest of his life. And to me, this narrative too perfectly demonstrates how we culturally disappear queerness and those labeled as criminal from public life. The stigmatized identities of the criminal and the queer added on to his Blackness somehow disqualified him from an independent personhood. But I knew there had to be more, because these biographies described him as a musician, someone involved in public lectures and Harlem nightlife, and a public dandy who wore a chrysanthemum in his lapel. So I knew there was more, so I kept on digging. I started making progress when I transitioned from searching secondary documents to finding archival documents. And this is when I developed a deep and real appreciation for archivists, librarians, and other workers who find, index, digitize, and make accessible these documents. It is here that the picture about who this person is started to get clearer. The first major breakthrough came when I started going beyond the first page of search results of various search engines. So in page 5 and 11 and 17 and so on, I found links to all sorts of primary documents that then led me to other documents. Through this, I discovered the W.E.B. Du Bois papers, a large online database of primary documents hosted at UMass Amherst. I found some newspaper clippings in these documents, which led me to searching newspaper databases. And these were the most useful source of information about Dill's life after he was fired in 1928. I also found out that there were physical archives at Clark Atlanta University, where he attended for undergrad and worked after receiving his second degree from Harvard. So I traveled there and spent some time documenting several years worth of correspondence. And I also knew that he was involved in several different publications. So I found archives of the crisis in the Brownies book. And after a lot of time and a lot of dead end searching, a clearer picture began to emerge about who this man was. And after spending hours finding texts and combing through archives and taking notes, a full person came into focus. So more than being the sidekick for a more prominent historical figure or a cautionary story about queer life in the early part of the last century, I found that Dill did in fact have a huge impact, not just on both the people and communities around him, but on culture today. In 1920, he formed a publishing company with Du Bois, and the pair created the Brownies book, the first ever magazine created for Black children. And this magazine was one of the few places where Black children could see representations of themselves celebrating success and family and engaging in play and joy in ways that were not cartoonist caricatures. So you can see the picture on the left is the not from the crisis, but the example of what was the typical representation at the time. And Langston Hughes, the renowned poet and activist who I mentioned earlier, published his first ever poems in the Brownies book. And Dill even played an important role in helping Hughes reach the renowned status that he holds today, as he introduced Hughes to Harlem's social and intellectual life. And Hughes actually lived with Dill for a time when he first moved to New York. He helped curate what was at the time the largest collection of Black art at the 135th Branch Library, which, like the Stonewall that Marshall mentioned earlier, today is a New York LGBT historical site. In 1932, he opened a bookstore and community center at 234 West 135th Street in Harlem. You can see that this building today is a barber shop. And it was there where he held monthly performance series where artists like Annie Wiggins Brown and Ruby Elzy, who both went on to perform on Broadway, had some of their earliest performances. And he helped Maurice Hunter, the man of 1,000 faces, one of the first prominent Black models, get his start. And these are just some of Augustus Granville Dill's many accomplishments and contributions to culture and the movement for Black liberation. He continued his public speaking, journalism, performing, and activism up until his death in 1956 in Louisville, Kentucky. In addition to the specifically sociological significance of his work, which is outside the scope of this presentation, there are two other products of this research that I think highlight the importance of visiting and revisiting these histories, especially by different people and at different times. So we know that knowledges and standpoints position individuals to view documents and events in certain ways. So in the same way that other scholars' standpoints may have led them to assume the insignificance of Augustus Dill to anyone's history, my standpoint as a Black and queer scholar actually was what drew me to pursue this research. So among the many previous misconceptions about Dill's life, work, and importance, I want to highlight a few and offer some corrections. First is the idea that he did nothing of significance after parting ways with Du Bois and the NAACP. This encyclopedia entry is just one example of this. And you can see here it reads, arrested in 1928 in New York as a homosexual, Dill was fired by Du Bois, and unable to find work, he spent the rest of his life in obscurity. While it's true that Dill experienced periods of homelessness and joblessness, especially in the period directly after his arrest, I think, as I touched on in the last section, the idea that he couldn't find work and live the rest of his life in obscurity is clearly a misrepresentation. And in addition to his entrepreneurship with the Harlem Personal Service Shop, he was making money several different ways. including writing as a reporter for the International Negro Press and playing the organ at John Haynes Home's Community Church, which was an important staple of the community, and integrated church with a white minister who was also a co-founder of the NAACP and friend of Dill. And while he may have been removed from the NAACP after his arrest, he still maintained close relationships with his colleagues and surely did not fade into obscurity, and was in fact recognized as an important orator, artist, and activist even outside of New York. You can see here him on the far right of the picture that in 1936, he was included in a Dallas-based mural as a part of an exhibit about important Black artists. And in 1951, an article published in a Louisville, Kentucky-based newspaper discusses his work after having moved there a few years earlier. And finally, I want to correct the idea that perhaps his most important relationship, that with Du Bois, did not survive this scandal. Not only is this factually incorrect, but it reinforces a narrative about Black homophobia and diminishes the role of kinship in Black communities. The reality is that, like Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin, Du Bois did distance himself from Dill out of political necessity, but he maintained a personal relationship with him and worked to make sure his friend was taken care for. During periods where Dill experienced hardship, Du Bois was in contact with Reverend Helms, who I mentioned earlier, and Dill's sister in Kentucky, Mary Broadus, to help organize resources and strategize how best to help get his friend back on his feet. And even 20 years later, you can see here a note from Dill written to Du Bois on an announcement card for Dill's 70th birthday. On the card, he writes, "How fine it is to be 70 years young, not 70 years old. More than 200 cards, letters, telegrams, and presents galore came to greet me on the day, and I'm very, very happy indeed. I have cried and cried and cried as I have read these lovely messages which came to me from north and south, from east and west. This note in particular is very special to me. So much of what we know about queer people, Black people, and especially queer Black people from history is about their struggles with homophobia, with religious fundamentalism, and violence from the state. But after spending so many hours getting to know this person through these historical documents, I developed deep feelings of care and attachment for this person who exists outside of my history. So I'm always happy to know that despite his hardships, that at 70 years old, he could write, 'I can't cry more. Down deep in my heart, I am very happy and appreciative.' So finally, I focus this presentation on my research and standpoint, given the venue, and I hope that my experience can be of use to others who do this work, to others who are drawn to preserve, collect, and share the stories of our queer ancestors. There's much more to learn about Dill's life, work, and my theorizing on his legacy is on why his legacy is unknown to so many. And you can read more about these in my publication, forthcoming book chapter. I can share links to previous talks on YouTube, and of course, I'm happy to discuss these further in a Q&A. I just want to end by returning to this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois and stress the importance of the work being done and presented by my colleagues here today. We are in a time when across the country and especially here in my home state of Tennessee, legislation is being put in place to make it even more difficult to have these recovered histories be present in the public consciousness and to exert influence in the lives of all people who would learn about them. And when those antagonistic policies are supported by those who would harass and threaten people doing these public reclamations and reckonings with our history, spaces like these are invaluable to building networks of support as we continue in this work. I want to thank the Arizona Preservation Foundation for organizing this webinar, my colleagues for their work, and everyone in attendance today. Thank you. And I will pass on to the next speaker, Shane Watson.
Hi, everyone. I presume you can hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen now, start my slideshow. Okay, great, thanks. My name is Shane Watson. I'm an architectural historian and preservation planner based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I will be talking today about my work on LGBTQ heritage preservation in San Francisco specifically. The first project I'll talk about is the citywide historic context statement for LGBTQ history in San Francisco. I was the co-director along with public historian Donna Graves and co-author. I guess I wanted to say first what the need for the context statement was. So San Francisco was actually is the first city in the country to have an LGBTQ historic context statement. It was written in, I believe it was 2004 by the group Friends of 1800. It was quite a short document, but groundbreaking nonetheless. So the other reason it needed to be expanded on, but the other reason I wanted to work on this is because it was personal to me. I'm a lesbian. I started to look around the city and wonder where all the lesbian landmarks were. There really weren't any. I went back to grad school. I wrote my thesis on San Francisco's first lesbian historic district, which was in North Beach. And I always knew that I wanted to do some sort of citywide report for the city. So Donna and I reached out to the Glbt Historical Society, which is one of the most amazing archives in the world for LGBTQ history. It's based in San Francisco. They became our fiscal sponsor. We applied for a grant from the San Francisco Historic Preservation Fund Committee. And I think the grant was $25,000 to write the report and then a little bit more for community outreach. And so we started working on it in 2014, eventually wrapped up in 2016, essentially working on it nonstop. It became very much a passion project for both of us. That grant did not cover hardly any of our time. In terms of methodology, just one thing that Don and I both felt strongly about was we wanted to focus on as many underrepresented communities within this already very underrepresented community. We looked especially to oral history interviews that had been collected in the archives since the 80s at the Glbt Historical Society, to especially look for the stories of non-white, non-gay men. So we ended up doing a couple intensive focus workshops to especially reach out to elders who identified as people of color or trans or otherwise non-binary. And we also wanted to focus on places that weren't just bars, because one of the, as you've heard so far, is one of the primary focus of a lot of our history, especially site-based history up to this point, has been bar focused. And the bar history of LGBTQ history is important, but it is depressing and dark and very, very sad, and ultimately resulted in a lot of, self-destruction. So we wanted to also steer clear, in addition to bars we looked at, but we also wanted to look at other places where these communities developed and unfolded throughout the city. The most important piece of the context statement, in my mind, is the evaluation framework. So this is where we provide the City of San Francisco's planning department with the actual tools to evaluate places that come up with potential associations for these histories. The city took our data, which we, 300 or 400 individual sites, we inserted into an Excel spreadsheet with lots of columns for data. All of that was ultimately given to the city to go into their GIS mapping system, which is publicly accessible through what's called the San Francisco Property Information Map. And that is easily Googleable, but if you enter an address in the San Francisco Property Information Map, let's say 440 Broadway, which was the first lesbian nightclub maybe in California, 440 Broadway, if you click on the preservation tab, it will tell you this place has been identified in the historic context statement as potentially significant and on page 300 for these reasons. And so really what it's doing is providing, it sends up a red flag for the city anytime someone proposes either demolition or substantive alteration to potential LGBTQ historic properties. So it's essentially helping us streamline the CEQA process in California, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. Cultural resources have to be reviewed for potential historic significance under CEQA. It's essentially based on National Register criteria and evaluation guidance. It's also already helped us provide or create more landmarks in the city. We, I think, had 2 or 3 when we started the context statement. Now there aren't many more than that, but the city is really working actively to not only identify more of these sites, but also provide a layer of protection for them. Our most recent landmark is the home of Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, which I helped get landmarked last fall when we found out the house was sold once after Phyllis Lyon passed away in April of 2020. And those are, if people don't know those names, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon were co-founders of the nation's first lesbian rights organization. It was called the Daughters of Bilitis. They founded it in 1955. The same year they purchased their house in San Francisco, the one that we just landmarked. So it's an incredible history, worth looking up. And then also the city is consultants who are asked to provide evaluations for projects, for building specific evaluations, have already identified several potential LGBTQ historic districts in the city. And as you may know, a potential district in California is pretty much the same legally as an identified designated district. So it's another layer of protection. And then it's already been talked about, but I was really lucky in 2014 to be invited to participate in a scholars roundtable in Washington, DC, with about a dozen other people from across the country who got to weigh in on what became the table of contents of and general outline of the theme study for the Park Service. And this is it's a kind of an extraordinary document. It was really only able to happen because of, I think, a few people in the Park Service who really pushed for it. And it was also timing. It was the end of the Obama administration. And so there was a big rush to get it done. And it still feels pretty shocking to me that it is the first report on LGBTQ history commissioned by a federal government. So it's pretty cool. And again, the need for that was, and it's already been mentioned, but an underrepresentation in the National Register. When we started working on this, the Stonewall was the first LGBTQ site listed in the National Register. In 2009, it was still the only site. Then it eventually became a National Historic Landmark and then a monument. Slowly more sites have been added, especially thanks to the New York City LGBTQ Historic Sites Project. A good friend of mine, Amanda Davis, is the project manager, and she just, every time I do one of these panels and I want to update people about the latest number of National Register sites, I call her. So the latest number is, we actually have 26 LGBTQ associated sites in the National Register as of today. Tomorrow, she said, there will be one more added. And I think the last one was Darcells in Portland, Oregon, added in 2020. So yeah, and I think anyone interested in doing a context statement in your city, you could look at the San Francisco chapter instead of just going into San Francisco's history, which everyone is kind of maybe bored of by now. We provided like a kind of a step-by-step guidance on how to write a context statement, just get it done in your community. And then finally and quickly, what I think is maybe one of the best answers we've come up with so far is, to the question or the problem of how do we stabilize and protect the living, breathing communities who live in these historic buildings and have lived and worked and played in these buildings throughout history? How do we protect them from, potential displacement, especially in a place like San Francisco where gentrification, cost of living, et cetera, is just, displacement is a real threat. And so these cultural districts, which actually were created I think in the 80s, I think maybe the American Indian Cultural District was the first. But over the last 10 years or so, they've become formalized, especially with the creation of Japantown. The city worked with consultants and the Japantown community members to create a report that we call a CHESS report that now each cultural district is required to have. And these are cultural history, housing, and economic sustainability strategy reports. And so each report, or these reports, are a 3-year strategic plan, but essentially these cultural districts are the ones who've been created, or, step back. We now have 3 LGBTQ cultural districts that have been created in the last couple of years. The Comptons Transgender Cultural District, which is now just Transgender Cultural District, was formed in the Tenderloin a couple of years ago by 3 Black trans women. And it's incredible the work they're doing, the money they're getting through their supervisor, through their district. The money is based on supervisor districts. But it's also, I'm a consultant for the Leather and LGBTQ Cultural District, which is based in the south of Market. And then the third one is the Castro Historic District, just, an LGBTQ basic Castro district. And that was our most recent. But I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, because I think there's so much excitement around cultural districts. But I'm going to wrap up for now, and I will pass it on to Seth Anderson. Thank you so much, everyone.
Am I seen? Connie, are you gonna change that, or am I able to change the slides?
I'm able to. Just let me know when to change the slide.
Okay, cool, thank you. Can you see me okay? Am I on? I don't see myself.
I don't see yourself.
But you can see me. If you can see me, that's fine.
We got you, Seth.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so thank you, Marcus, Carolyn, Marshall, Shane. These have been really excellent presentations. It's reminded me of why I even came to history in the first place, was through historic preservation many years ago that set me on this path that I've been on ever since. And so, and Carolyn in particular, I feel that fire again that I used to feel when I was in Phoenix, and I miss being there. I hope to return to Phoenix soon. I'm currently in Boston for the time being, but I would love to end up back in Phoenix doing this work with all of you there. So today I was asked to talk about a book that I published with Arcadia Publishing a couple years ago, specifically about how I went about writing it, share some of the interesting things I found, and some of the images as well. So my interest in history has always been local, and local stories that have been generally overlooked. I remember getting in arguments with people back in the day in Phoenix when people would complain that Phoenix wasn't New York. And I was like, well, of course it's not New York. Like, that's incoherent to me. Why? It's not New York, it's Phoenix. It has its own history, its own flavor. It has so much more to tell us beyond the New York story. So I've always been into those places that are sort of overlooked. Mid-sized American cities have a lot to say and to teach us about American history, and I'm sure I don't need to convince anybody of that here. My work as a grad student then has been to put these local history stories, particularly gay, lesbian, LGBT, queer histories, into conversation with the national historiographies, and to see how they overlap and how they don't. And of course, the Phoenix story should be told. I'm so excited that this work is being done in Phoenix. It's just awesome. So in 2012, I published a book with Jim McPherson, Suad Mahmoulan, about downtown Phoenix. That's that first slide right there. Connie, if you want to pull that up, or that's fine, that's that. And this was, I loved working on this project with Jim. It was my first foray into thinking like a historian, writing like a historian. And it was about buildings and neighborhoods and places and place making, homes and places of business, churches. It was a joy to work on. And as soon as we finished that book and published it, which Jim was like 10 years ago at this point, I sent an email to the editor that we had worked with, and I said, hey, you know what, I have this idea for like a gay Phoenix book. Do you like that? That sounds kind of cool. What do you think? And they wrote back and they said, thank you, we are not interested at this time. And that kind of bugged me then, but it was actually the better answer, because I couldn't have told the story that I did eventually after I had gone to graduate school. So even though I was irritated, it worked out for the best. I soon then moved back to Salt Lake. I grew up in Salt Lake and Phoenix. Both are my home. I feel very comfortable in both. And I went back to Salt Lake for love and for graduate school. And like any new grad student, you're trying to think of a project and something to say and something you want to do. And I started asking a lot of questions. I knew that I wanted to work on the history of gay Salt Lake, LGBT Salt Lake, but I really didn't know where to look, and I really couldn't find anything, which surprised me. Like nothing I looked up at the library or anywhere could I find a source that would provide me any kind of anchor into that story. But I started to meet a lot of people in Salt Lake, elderly people who had been in Salt Lake for many years, who had grown up and been young people in the 70s and 80s and had a lot of stories to tell. And they were happy to share those stories. And as I got to know them and interview them and learn about, kind of start making this little mental map of places and things and events that had happened, I asked, where can I read about this? They said, well, nowhere really. But more annoyingly, there was things to learn. It just hadn't been compiled. It was just kind of spread out everywhere, in newspaper articles, in blog posts, in audio oral histories, and some videos and some news stories. And so I kind of had started to cook up this idea that like this, all of these things can be compiled into something that, while it won't be necessarily a historical monograph, it's not going to be the deep dive into something, it could be a springboard into exploring this history in more depth. And so I put that idea in the back of my mind as I was working on my master's thesis. And I was reading a journal from a man who, thank goodness, had been a really great journaler. And he was telling this story in the mid-'80s about his own struggle being gay in Utah, his struggles with being a gay Mormon, and trying to figure out how to make that work. And he told this story about a man named Claire Harwood. And Claire was a young man in 1986 who was dying from HIV/AIDS, was in the late stages of that. He had gone to his Mormon bishop and was excommunicated. And this became a big story in Salt Lake. It was covered in the Salt Lake Tribune. And because it brought together so many themes of typical themes of mid-'80s sexuality and religion, although that kind of battle between the two isn't the full story, which I learned later in my research in Salt Lake. But I had to learn more about this guy and what had happened. So I started looking through digitized newspapers and found this image. So Connie, can you scroll down to the second image there? It's kind of a hard image to look at. This was Claire. This was the image that I found in the newspaper. There's a lot to analyze here, like his downward gaze, the KS on his body. And in the back, the photo hanging on the wall, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure, is the Ogden Mormon Temple. Claire was from Ogden. And so it just suggests this tension of religion in the lives of people at this time. And I just really loved this image. And this kicked off what became my master's thesis. And then pretty much every research project that I've done since then, I traced to this image, and just how struck I was by this and the story that it told. And it made me think, well, what's the story of HIV/AIDS in Utah? I knew a lot about that in New York or San Francisco, but I also intuited that story is going to look very differently in Salt Lake than it does in New York. How did it play out? Where were the sites of care? Who were the people who did the work? What happened? So that began my project in casting a wide net to kind of understand this history in Salt Lake, and to eventually what became this book. So then, Connie, the next image there, the cover of the book that I eventually published a few years after that was LGBT Salt Lake. The editors they didn't force me, but they kind of hinted like, no, it'd be better if there was like a picture of the temple on the cover. And I kind of resisted that because I didn't want the book to be perceived as like this Mormon versus LGBT story, because that wasn't what the story I was trying to tell. I had a lot more to say, and there was a lot more to that story than merely that. So I didn't set out to write this book when I started graduate school, because I had, to write a thesis and coursework, whatever. But I always filed it away in the back of my mind that an Arcadia book could be completed with all the stuff that I was finding. Then, Connie, scroll to the next image, please. The next project that I kind of worked on was the city and the university had created this project called Mapping Salt Lake. And they were doing, mapping, Google mapping places that were just not a typical map, right? And I wanted to do this LGBT map, which is here. So this was all, I found and mapped all the places in Salt Lake pre-1970 to 79. This included the bars, churches, this included parks, this included gay-friendly businesses. Anything that I could find and identify, I mapped on here. And I was surprised at how many there were in the 70s. I didn't expect to see that. My plan was to do it, 1980 to 89, 1999. Those ones didn't get done, but what does happen is as the community, those places start to shrink and they start to go away. Like Phoenix, Salt Lake demolished a lot of its gay history as well, and that's what this map was showing. Then after I graduated, there was a day on Facebook where I saw a image, an advertisement for it. It was like LGBT Milwaukee or something like that with Arcadia. And I immediately dug up my old email from a couple years prior and said, hey, remember that idea I had? Like, I'm ready to go. Like, it seems like you're now into this as well. The Modern Images of America color series is available. Like, let's do it. And they said, great, send us a proposal in a couple weeks. I sent it in like 2 days. I knew exactly the story that I wanted to tell. Because I knew the people, the places, the events, the buildings, all of that stuff I had finally gathered and had in the back of my head, and it just needed to be compiled and available to the public in a way that people could start to understand and consume and integrate into their thinking about how gay Salt Lake was and is, and its rich and robust LGBT history. So Salt Lake, like Phoenix, is a big, small town. Both are full of surprises. Both have history hiding in plain sight if you know where to look. And so one of the things that surprised me was just how gay Salt Lake how gay it had always been. Salt Lake is this interesting city in that it's kind of in this liminal space, kind of like Phoenix, where some people think it's just a big, or a small cow town, and they just got to get it out of the small town. It's too little. For other people, Salt Lake was the big city, and they came from rural communities in Idaho or southern Utah, Wyoming, and Salt Lake was huge, and it was this big magnet. Especially after the war years, Salt Lake grew, not as quickly as other places, but it did. There was an influx of people that there began to emerge this gay subculture, gay underground. Also to my benefit in working on this LGBT Salt Lake book was that there was a man in Salt Lake who had, for years, been writing chronologies of all these events. He had moved to Utah in the early 70s as a young man to go to college, and lived through a ton of stuff that had happened, and he had the foresight, thought like a historian, to keep all these things, to file them away, to keep records. And nobody had done anything with them, but when I met him and got to talk to him, and he was so willing to share with me this work that he had done, it laid out this roadmap for me in a way that I didn't have to like reinvent the wheel. It just gave me these excellent beginning places to start this work. And so his work, though, gave me the history post the 70s into the 80s and 90s, which is a huge chunk of this story. But I also needed to know before that, and that was a little harder. Luckily as well, another huge break came for me. I found a dissertation that somebody had published in 2008 called The Lavender Sons of Zion. And it was an oral history project with about a dozen men who were young men in the 50s and 60s. And the author of this dissertation had interviewed them, had reconstructed their lives. And in that was such a rich mine of places from the 50s and 60s, some of which did still exist. And that helped me tell that story of the 50s, up to the 70s. It starts to get a little murky. In the 40s, evidence is sparse. There are different cultural, social ideas in play. And it gets a lot harder to historically talk about gender and sexual minorities before like our kind of present ideas of what that is, exist. But I did find evidence of things. I was trying to be as responsible as I could in telling the stories without making too many big claims of putting people into boxes they maybe didn't identify as. My grad school training helped me with that, with those tools that I needed to tell the story. And then it was a challenge when I started writing. It was a challenge compared to my Phoenix book, because the Phoenix book was about buildings and neighborhoods. This was about people and identities and communities that were not static and not a monolith, and how to tell that story responsibly. So then the first chapter of the book is intentionally in black and white. It spans the 19th century up to 69. And the West is such an interesting place anyway, particularly as it relates to boundaries and maps, that I began the book with a discussion of shifting boundaries. Particularly, it showed some historical maps of, this is what Utah looked like for time. And then people with power and authority kind of redrew the lines this way. And this is how we think of it now, but there's no line in the sand. It's just kind of made up. And I use that as a parallel to talk about the way that identities shift and change and morph over time. My primary sources for the book, the photographs, came from the state archives, from the LDS Church archives, from the BYU archives, from the University of Utah archives, but specifically it came from people who in the community had just these treasure troves of photographs that I was so happy to share with the public. So I'll show some of these archival photos, images from people and newspapers and photographers, and tell some of these stories. So Connie, go ahead and scroll up on this one. This one I found in the state archive. This was a woman named Louie Felt, and she was, this came from the LDS Church archives. She was a woman who worked in the church in the late 19th, early 20th century in the children's organization. She was the editor and published a magazine. Now it's called The Children's Friend. I believe it was called The Friend then. And she was fascinating because she was a sister, or was a plural wife in the late 19th century. And her husband died, and she and her sister wife lived together for about 40, 50 years. And they worked for the church. They published, they worked with children. There was an article that I found that talked about how much they loved each other, that they even shared a bed. And I was very cautious not to be like, oh, she's clearly lesbian. But I kind of waved towards like, oh, here's an interesting, Utah's interesting, people don't always fit into boxes so easily in the past. And I really loved her story. Connie, scroll down to the next one. This one is fun. People sometimes see this and they think, oh, and I think they misread it. So I kind of argued against this misreading. This was a man named Brigham Morris Young. He was Brigham Young's son. And he performed as a character named Madame Paterini, performed around the state and sang in a high falsetto voice, apparently. People read this as a drag queen, and I kind of pushed back, said, no, that's not what this is, but it showed kind of, I think, this fluidity of that he performed around the state. Brigham Young's son. It didn't seem to cause a ruckus that he performed as a woman, or woman character rather. And there's just some satisfaction, I think, in seeing Brigham Young's son performing as a woman. Then scroll down, Connie. This is Regent Street. This was a street in Salt Lake where a lot of sexual life happened. This was where a lot of prostitutes were, and the brothels were there. There was also reports of male prostitutes with the male clientele. And I liked this photo because it allowed me to kind of bring together the story of economies of vice and how those are often linked to gender and sexual minority stories. And so this more of just a cityscape thing. And a lot of that's been preserved, luckily, not all of it, but some of it's still there. All right, scroll down, Connie, please. This one I was really pleased with. So one of the places in Phoenix that was known in the 40s and 50s as a gay bar was this place called the Crystal Lounge. And I couldn't find an image of it anywhere. It just, nothing came up. And I figured out its address. I knew where it was. And I found this archive, or this photo collection at the state archives of photos of State Street. And so State Street's one of the main roads in Salt Lake. The Capitol building's up into the top right. You can see right there. And luckily, I was looking through these photos. I was like, oh my gosh, there it is. And it's kind of obscured by that wreath. But this was the only photograph that I could find of what is considered to be Salt Lake's first gay bar, in the Crystal Lounge. And this photo was taken about 1954. Across the street was another gay bar called the Radio City Lounge, and I couldn't find any photos of that, unfortunately. Both have now been demolished and I'm not even sure what's there. I think the Crystal Lounge was a parking lot until fairly recently. I think it's being redeveloped right now. Scroll up again, Connie, please. This was another interesting story, working on this, that allowed me to bring the FBI and national story to Salt Lake. So that man on the left is Cleon Skousen, often known as a far-right, I guess, provocateur maybe, or political commentator. In the 40s, he worked for the FBI, worked with J. Edgar Hoover. And at the time of the Lavender scare, as historians have called it, was trained there, ends up back in Salt Lake in the 50s, works as a professor at BYU, was eventually tapped to be chief of police in Salt Lake. And it was under his leadership as chief of police that the heaviest crackdowns on gay places in Salt Lake occurred. There's a story, and I can't confirm this. I hope it's true because it's really great. But the story I heard from one of my oral histories was that there was a gay man who worked in the police department, and when Skousen would go out to do a raid, the man working in the police department would call ahead and say, "Hey, get out! Skousen's on his way." I don't know if that's true, but I hope it is. But this linking this into the bigger gay story of Salt Lake and the nation. A lot of people know about Skousen. That wasn't known about the police presence, that there was enough of a gay presence that the police were aware of it, that they would crack down on it in Salt Lake in the 50s is kind of surprising. Connie, next one, please. This was an excellent photo or image that I found in an archive. The Cricket, published by the Metropolitan Community Church, started in 1968 by Troy Perry. And by 71, there is a Metropolitan Community Church branch in Salt Lake, and they published this newsletter. And it's the first one I can find of a gay-themed newsletter published for the community. And what's also fascinating to me about this is that there was a gay church in Salt Lake before there was a gay bar, or an official gay bar. The Crystal Lounge was a place people could go, and they kind of were okay there, but it wasn't run by gay people. It wasn't for gay people. They kind of had a very tenuous relationship. The first gay bar opens in 73, but the Metropolitan Community Church is there publishing for the gay community, LGBT community in 71, which I think speaks to this need to move away from the conversation about gay versus religion, that there are LGBT people who are religious, who want to have a community and a home within a religious community, who feel very pained and traumatized by their religious upbringing when they're kind of forced out. But the Cricket was there, MCC's there, it's still there actually, along with some other early gay-friendly churches that have existed since the early 70s. Connie, scroll up, please. This was another excellent image I found of, there we go, thank you, of the Gayzette. It was, and some images have been shown from like Phoenix's, that Salt Lake, like Phoenix, had a pretty robust LGBT press and published a ton of newsletters for themselves and to communicate to the broader community. And I thought it was important for people to see that in the early 70s, the Salt Lake gay community was big enough to have several newsletters to talk about their lives and what was going on. So I use that in the book as well. Scroll down again, please. So those were all archival photos that I was able to find. There was a robust archive that looks like in Phoenix also exists, similar things like that. Images from people that I received through oral history and just reaching out and asking, hey, can you tell me about this? Do you have anything you can share with me? And they did. Oops, I'm not going down again. Thank you. This one is excellent. I was really thrilled with this. This came from a man who was interviewed for the Lavender Sons book. And it's clearly a flyer for a drag show at a place called the Tin Angel. And up in the top left corner that says 340 North State, that was its original location. And I was able to determine with using the phone book that the Tin Angel was only at that location from 1967 to the late 68, early 69. So this means then that Salt Lake was hosting drag shows in the late 60s at the Tin Angel. Again, another thing that surprised me, I didn't think I would see that, or something so obvious even in those years in Salt Lake, but sure enough, there it was. And then the next photo, please. This was the gay bar, the first gay bar, the Sun Tavern, built at 3rd West and South Temple. And so that's Joe Redburn front, he was the owner of it. It was the first gay bar that had a sign and was publicized. He ran ads as far away as San Francisco and New York in gay papers there, that Salt Lake has a gay bar. If you're ever in town, this is where you would come. The Sun Tavern served as the primary epicenter, cultural epicenter for the gay community in Salt Lake for a couple decades. It was, everything happened there until a little bit later. Other bars started to open up, but that was the place everybody loved and went to. It was unfortunately demolished, as most of these things were, in the late 80s, early 90s, to make way for what became the Delta Center, which is the arena where the Utah Jazz plays. And so that allowed this urban history conversation to to be brought in of like, where does the development happen? Why is it on these places, not others? And it was because this side of town, just barely west of downtown, was and had been the working class community, the ethnic community, the immigrant community, the gay community was kind of centered over here as well. And that was the first place that was demolished to make way for other new development. The next photo I got from a man named Scott Stites, who was part of a group called the Royal Court of the Golden Spike Empire. And it was this national, and still exists and to a smaller degree, of a community of fundraising through drag and parties kind of thing. This was a man named Michael Spence, who performed as Tracy Ross. The Royal Court of the Golden Spike Empire hosted in 1986. They were the first to raise money for people with AIDS in Utah. They raised over $10,000, and that went to help people pay rent and buy food and for medical care. And I love this. Scott was one of those like gold mines where I just kind of reached out cold turkey. I'd never met him. I didn't know him. And he's like, oh yeah, I have like 5 gigantic photo albums. Come look at them. I was like, oh, awesome. And there was a treasure trove of drag shows from the 70s and 80s. Their fundraisers, the places they met, it was excellent. And again, I was happy that I was able to provide that and put this in a book and share it. Okay, next, scroll down a little bit more. This was from a man named Connell O'Donovan. It was the first first Pride March in 1990. It's the only image I could find. Actually, there's 2, but this was the first one that they organized and put together. And I used this to compare in the book, you know, how the community grows, because you can see from the photos that I had how small it was up until about 2015, when it's just Pride is the second biggest thing, I believe, in Salt Lake after the Days of 47 parade. It's enormous. And just to see the growth of that in a pretty short time in Salt Lake is kind of cool. And then scroll down another, please. This is Salt Lake also had a chapter of Queer Nation. It didn't have an ACT UP, but it had for a short little while a queer radical contingent that did all kinds of protests and marches and zaps, and the stuff that I generally kind of associated with things that went on in New York or San Francisco happened in the early 90s in Salt Lake, of course, on a much smaller scale. This was one of their protests that they did in front of the Salt Lake Temple, where a lot of them chained themselves to the temple, were arrested. It was a really fiery, very angry, as you can expect, group. And it kind of fizzled out as quickly as it started. I think that kind of rage politics kind of has a short lifespan. And a lot of them moved away, some stayed. But Connell had come back to Utah. And again, he was another person who had just such a treasure trove of photos that had never been seen. And then the next one, please. These are images I found in newspapers. So this was I was able to dig through here with the help of Ben Williams's chronology. I kind of knew some events that had happened. So this was, I was so lucky. I remember just gasping when I was able to find this. Anita Bryant came to Salt Lake in 1977. So in the national story of Anita Bryant and the protests, some scholars have argued that's really the formation of a national gay community, because it's the first time that at a national level, people kind of are fighting the same thing and talking in the same way and on the same page in a lot of ways. And Anita came to Salt Lake. She sang at the fairgrounds, and it was the first time that the gay community in Salt Lake organized and protested. And I refer to this as Utah's Stonewall, because it was the first time that the community had ever done something like this. And so you can see on the left the anti-protests of the old women, probably on Anita's side, and then on the right, a lot of them from the university. They were students, as oftentimes is the case. Scroll down, please. This was another kind of really breathtaking moment when I found this. This image came from a BYU student newspaper, and this was a protest at the Salt Lake Temple during conference. The Mormon Church has conference twice a year, spring and the fall. And this, after the Anita protest, was the second time I was able to find people gathering to protest. And they protested on Temple Square. And I just thought this was stunning that the BYU covered it, took a picture and published it, and probably because a lot of them were BYU students or had just graduated. So that was another great find, an avenue into a particular history that seems surprising, that even at BYU in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a gay student group and contingent that was politically active. And then finally, down here in the book, I tried to keep out of the book any photo that was available online, and I just really wanted to show images that hadn't been seen. So this was kind of how I ended the book, was this image of Pride, I think from 2013. It was as people were starting to gather. And this doesn't even show the extent of how big Salt Lake Pride is, it had become. But that was in the book, just to see the growth of the community, right? And its presence and its political power that it had achieved. And then final one down here is another political movement at the Capitol with, I think this was around the marriage debate in late 2013. And so in the book, there's a lot of photographs like this of the political activism that occurred really in force about 2008 because of Prop 8 and moving forward up into the marriage stuff and beyond. So I had a great time writing this book and sharing these stories. If unfortunately so much of the buildings that could be preserved are gone, how else can we teach the history? I thought, how else can I share this history and make it accessible to a wide reading public in a way that's not threatening, that's just very truthful and forthright about what people have done and who's been around and the work that they have done. It was and so I loved working on it. There's so much potential for Phoenix to create a similar Arcadia book, I think, that, again, in the way of not a deep dive necessarily, but in the way to disseminate information, share those stories. And there's so much in Phoenix that makes it unique to Salt Lake. The Latino story is much more robust, the Native American story, the religious story, the student groups of the 70s and 80s at ASU, the military story in Phoenix, the healthcare sites, that HIV/AIDS story in Phoenix hasn't yet been told. The first political leaders who are elected, when are they elected? Who do they represent? What do they do? All of that is such a rich source of LGBT storytelling and history to be made available. Salt Lake, has been mentioned. Phoenix also has its gay neighborhoods, just like Salt Lake did. Melrose, Coronado, for example. I also love the story of the Corona Ranch Rodeo, which hosted the first gay rodeo in Arizona in 1984. I think that's super cool. Phoenix, as has been mentioned, has a very robust bar history. It has its own religious history. The Casa de Cristo is a really fascinating story about marriage and marriage equality in Phoenix in the 70s. As has been mentioned, a huge source and wealth of published and digitized papers that tell his story. And there's just so much potential. And I wish I was in Phoenix. I wish I could be working on it because that would be such a joy. But I'm so excited to be a part of this. Thank you for listening. I hope something's been helpful. And I am now going to turn this over to Alexis Rodriguez.
All right, hello everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. I want to first thank the Arizona Preservation Foundation for allowing us to participate in this panel and have this discussion on the issues of historic preservation and finding new ways to preserve it. Since the early 1980s, Queer Studies has provided a platform for historians to reassess traditional historic narratives while demonstrating the need to preserve marginalized voices as new histories. Attempts, both local and national, have been made in order to preserve such history, including the LGBTQ+ History Museum of Central Florida. Founded in 2005, the museum has centered its focus on the historic preservation of Central Florida's LGBTQ+ community through local outreach. This entails gathering interns and volunteers from local colleges and universities, participating in Orlando's Pride Parade, showcasing exhibits both on the museum's website and at the center, a nonprofit LGBTQ+ community service organization, and conducting a quarterly book club which focuses on LGBTQ+ authors and writers. Over the course of my time with the museum, previously as an intern and now as vice president, much of my research has centered on the female impersonation subculture in Central Florida and collecting oral histories, which often at times focus on certain queer spaces. As such, the focal point of this presentation will be on the intersection of female impersonation and their respective queer spaces, along with a case study. While scholarship has centered on the bar and nightclub scene as historic queer spaces, the role in which female impersonation plays within the developing and evolving structures of queer spaces needs to be further examined. Bear in mind that I will be quoting several people throughout this presentation as part of the developing history surrounding these topics. So in the summer of 2020, I became an intern for the museum and was assigned to conduct research on a photograph collection of various female impersonators which span over 6 decades. The project consisted of organizing metadata associated with the image, the performer, the event, if applicable, along with curator, date taken, item type, and location. Information pertaining to these images were relatively enigmatic, which made collecting and organizing the metadata difficult. Due to the lack of information, I began to use social media platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as tools in collecting information and contacting potential sources. Through developing a connection with the community by detailing the museum's project in gathering Central Florida's LGBTQ+ history, many joined in offering some of their stories and providing potential contacts. Most of the information provided through crowdsourcing on the museum's Facebook page promoted a discussion among patrons about Parliament House. Through collecting oral histories which focus on female impersonators, I came to also realize the issues of historical erasure of certain subcultures and queer spaces. Excuse me. While history of Central Florida's LGBTQ+ community prior to the 1960s was seldom due to its closeted and small community, demographics and culture within the region changed. The arrival of several organizations and businesses, such as the Kennedy Space Center in 1962, the University of Central Florida in 1968, and Disney World in 1971, increased the development of various establishments which catered to the LGBTQ+ population. In 1972, Bill Miller, Michael Hodge, Jan Koren, Wally Wood, and Suhana, who eventually became known as the Gay and Lesbian Gang, sought to create gay and lesbian clubs and bars in Orlando, 2 of which hold significance for both the gay and female impersonation history, the Diamond Head and Parliament House Orlando. The Diamond Head, considered the first gay bar of Central Florida, was purchased by Bill Miller and Michael Hodge and was a venue that provided a show bar for female impersonators and pageants, such as Miss Diamond Head. The date of its closing is unknown. Parliament House Orlando, once a part of a hotel chain in the early 1960s, which purchased by Bill Miller and Michael Hodge several years later and closed in November 2020. While Parliament House Orlando was considered a safe haven for Orlando's LGBTQ+ community due to social homophobia and recognized as, quote, one of the oldest gay resorts and entertainment complexes in the US, end quote, the significance of this queer space expands to other communities and subcultures. Within this gay resort was the Footlight Theater, where after the Diamond Head became a popular site within the national female impersonation subculture. By the mid-1960s, there was a burgeoning of talented regional female impersonators performing at a number of emerging gay and drag clubs. Throughout my conversations with drag performers, the Diamond Head and Parliament House was mentioned as key locations in the history of LGBTQ+ entertainment, but it was also considered a place of contention. Several performers from the early days mentioned that the use of the handkerchief by Orlando police, who would request random individuals at Parliament House to wipe their face when making their rounds as a means to arrest LGBTQ+ people who were female impersonators under the pretense of, quote, concealing their identity, end quote. Due to this, many of the performers refrained from dressing as impersonators before and after their performances, in comparison to contemporary drag performers who commonly dress prior to the shows and venture throughout the bars and clubs to meet their fans. Yet at the same time, this did not hinder the later creation of drag houses in Central Florida. As shown in the slide, each of these performers, though not only them, played a pivotal role in the development of Central Florida's early drag subculture, yet were absent from the archival narrative, including the role said subculture played in the development of Central Florida's LGBTQ+ community. Many of the early performers listed here not only performed at Parliament House, but lived there at times. In discussing Parliament House with Willie King Jr., shown here on the slide, known on stage as Von Gretchen, the connection drag performers had to the site was paramount to their success, as local drag queens, not only was it a place where most of them lived in that haven, quote, we lived in Parliament House, we worked at Parliament House, end quote. But in the words of Paul Wigman, and quote, Bill Miller's plays were always bigger and drew the most people, end quote. Yet Central Florida's gay scene was not isolated, as Tampa and South Florida became known for their queer spaces, including bars and clubs, which often at times was the only means of popularizing one's name through performing throughout these venues. The popularity of pageantry, for example, placed Central and South Florida in the periphery of the greater female impersonation subculture, as historian James T. Sears explains that, quote, Southern drag exploded in the South, and in 1972 marked the birth of two of the most venerable female impersonation pageants, end quote. With the creation of the state pageant Miss Florida in 1972, held a few months after the first Miss Gay America, many drag queens competed in subcategories which allowed female impersonators to travel and participate in national pageantry, as well as bring attention of potential visitors and residents to the region. 2022 will be the 50th anniversary of the pageant. Sears further quotes Paul Wigman, or known on stage as Miss P at Parliament House Orlando, that, quote, we would talk about Miss Florida all year long. So naturally a queen in Orlando or Tampa would want to be a part of that, but she had to get one of the bars behind her, end quote. Miss Florida was created by bar owners Keith Landon and Renee Rodriguez in the efforts to highlight and showcase female impersonation. After a decade and a half of inactivity, the pageantry was revived in 2014 by Allison Thomas, who remains its CEO. In her oral history interview, Allison explained that the purpose of the Miss Florida FI pageant was to not only showcase the beautiful illusion of these girls transitioning from male to female, but was a historical collection of some of the most iconic entertainers that began this industry for what it is today. Allison further remarked that it's very important that the new generation that is exposed to drag in a totally different way understand where it came from and the sacrifices that were made by the girls who started Miss Florida in the 1970s. Much of the pageantry was held in South Beach, where it was a red carpet event with city officials, fashion designers, and even celebrities being among the attendees. It was in these events that female impersonators would get exposure nationwide, which gave them the ability to get exposed to an agent or a manager that would allow them to be in a film. And according to Allison, many of the former Miss Florida pageant contestants went on to have great careers due to their exposure at the pageants. Quote, pageantry in the early days was basically the only outlet for gay people to express themselves, whereas these days with television, social media, and with all the different outlets, you can work at a bar or brunch and be known all over the world. In the 70s, it was about the video of the pageant that gave you your name, end quote. Willie Tillman, known as Geraldine Jones, and is the second oldest drag queen in the United States, further explained that the role pageantry had in the careers of these performers was important. It made a drag queen into a female impersonator or a pageant queen and allowed employment opportunities throughout the United States. Now, I have chosen these individuals in connection to this queer space as a presentations case study for several reasons. Due to Miss P being the MC of Parliament House Orlando till its passing in 2004 due to AIDS complications, I thought it would be best to examine how he further popularized the resort, along with his history with the emerging female impersonation pageantry in the 70s. So, Paul Wigman, known as Miss P, was born and raised in Rochester, New York, and moved to Florida in the 1960s, where he graduated with a magna cum laude with a BA in theater at the University of Central Florida. The character, Miss P, came about in the early 1970s at Palace Club near the Orlando Executive Airport, but became established at Parliament House in 1975 after getting a gig with Bill Miller. Here, he could be Miss P without reservation, as known for his witty insults to the audiences, while at the same time venturing out and presenting a number of gay-themed plays. While recognized for his famous role as Miss P and as the MC, Paul Wigman in the early years participated in regional pageants as well, and won Miss Gay Orlando in 1972. However, like many who would attempt to be sponsored by a nightclub for the pageantry, Paul Wigman stayed in Central Florida and created a name for himself. The popularity of Paul's character Miss P was so attached to Parliament House, as many of the patrons and employees stated, that most of the people who came to Parliament House came to see Miss P. Many of Miss P's memorable acts were held at the Footlight Theater, a small theater room within the resort. So this is the theater room. As you can see, it's pretty big for a gay nightclub, but it was an amazing location. So the Footlight Theater played an important role for Miss Central Florida and other similar pageants, which were held there, and was a precursor towards entering the national pageants. The Footlight Theater at Parliament House remained quintessential for many drag performers to perform and became famous. Queens like RuPaul, Alaska Thunderfuck, Bianca Del Rio, Sharon Needles, and so many others have journeyed to perform at this resort. Even local drag queen Lee Shannon, owner of Ritzy Rags and former employee, in reference to Parliament House stated that, quote, "They come from all over the world to visit this place. The shows, the icon factor, it's world famous. That's why I moved to Orlando 29 years ago. I landed a job there as a performer," end quote. Locke Robertson, known as April Fresh on stage and a previous employee at Parliament House, stated that, quote, "Because of this theater, people from all over the country would want to work here. And you know, a lot of places and a lot of big name girls have worked at a little neighborhood bar that has a little tiny stage in the corner, if that, or maybe even a small dance floor. So to have curtains and an actual theater style setting, the girls love that, you know. It's usually an honor to work here. All the plays they had here, plus they do a lot of different things here," end quote. So before I transition to the next slide, I would like to demonstrate the popularity of Parliament House. This photo was taken roughly around the 1990s on an event showcasing the magnitude of the resort, which would hold in its 10,000 square feet layout and 112 rooms to come see several drag performers and contests. As with any queer space, socioeconomic factors play into the preservation of the site. After the passing of Michael Hodge and Bill Miller, the resort was then owned by Michael's religious brother, who had no interest, and after several years was bought by Don and Susan, who revamped it in the 90s. Unfortunately, after several rumors of his closing or being placed under bankruptcy throughout the years, Parliament House Orlando was closed and demolished in 2020. Yet, as unfortunate as it is, this has become a common phenomenon throughout the United States. As listed on the slide, several of the iconic queer spaces in Central Florida have closed, and contemporary LGBTQ+ people continue to venture and assimilate into mainstream heteronormative spaces. In addition, drag performances has taken new forms and have become more widely accepted as part of the mainstream culture, as shown by the popularity of RuPaul's Drag Race and the Common Sunday brunches. With the disappearance of queer spaces, which allowed female impersonation to flourish, the issue of preserving these historic narratives and spaces comes into play. While Parliament House is reopening, supposedly, next year, it's going to be reopened at the center of downtown. So Parliament House before was at the outskirts of the downtown area, which allowed people to go there who, were dealing with some economic issues, so they can just park there and they didn't have to pay or anything, and the coverage was very cheap. But now, since it's going to be at the center of downtown, there's a lot of factors and issues that come into play. So originally a Motor Inn resort, it later became a haven for marginalized groups, which allowed many ostracized people to find temporary living and a place to feel safe in terms of gender expression. The association with the economically disenfranchised and crime with the area also plays into the issue of race and queer spaces. And, quote, reclaiming queer spaces, end quote, Gregory Samantha Rosenthal points to Andrew Hurley's analysis in the ways historic preservationists often neglect the histories of people who actually inhabited inner cities in their peak years of fiscal insolvency, rising crime rates, and crumbling infrastructure. So with Parliament House being now moved towards downtown, there's no apartments. I mean, there's no rooms for people to go stay. The Parliament House, the way that it was built, or the way they restructured it, in a way, it was kind of like boxed in. So even if police were to go around in the 80s, or I mean, in the 70s or 80s, they wouldn't be able to see what was going on and go and express themselves. But now with it being gone and now being placed within downtown, there is this lack of having a queer safe space, even though the bar may be Parliament House by name. That authentic space has been in a way dismantled because it's around other bars which are, straight. So what do we do as historians who focus on marginalized communities and their histories to counteract this issue? With local outreach, history harvest, and collecting oral histories, along with partnering with the University of Central Florida and gathering volunteers and interns, these are some of the ways that the museum has attempted to preserve the legacy and history of these queer spaces and performers. But obviously that is not enough. We're trying as much as we can. Unfortunately, due to lack of funding and everyone on the board being volunteers, it's been difficult trying to find financial support in either buying locations or at least trying to preserve the sites and the memory. But even though that's a bit gloomy, we are optimistic that at least we could, with a collection of oral histories and the photographs that we have taken, it will at least preserve the memory of it. Also recognizing that in the wake of Pulse, Orlando is planning to host the nation's largest museum documenting LGBTQ culture. The museum is continuing to explore and expand our role. We will continue to tell our community story in order to inspire future generations of activists. The museum also is working to make our collection more inclusive, to add more stories from lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, Spanish speakers, people of color, and those with disabilities. Excuse me. We hope to partner with another institution to provide a permanent home for our archival collection, which recently has been now UCF, and which will make it accessible for researchers and for the public. And we will continue to add to our virtual museum and look for spaces where our mobile exhibits can teach and share our history to honor those who have worked for the rights that we have today. I want to thank again the Arizona Preservation Foundation for allowing us to have this conversation and seeing the ways in which we can continue to preserve our history. This concludes my presentation, and I will hand off the screen to Eric Bondi.
Hi, thanks everybody. I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about a few grant opportunities that may help fund research into some of these properties. These are all, they're not open to the private sector. They're all nonprofit, state government, city government, something like that. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Connie. The first one I wanted to talk about is the Telling the Full Story, Telling the Full History Preservation Fund, which you can see as a due date of next week, December 15th, 2021. So that's coming up very quickly. This is a one-time grant put out by the National Trust that is focused on finding these stories and telling them. Eligible activities include interpretation of sites, research into sites, architectural plans on sites. So it's not bricks and mortar, it's purely for research. It does not appear to require a match, but without actually signing up and starting an application, I couldn't find that for certain. As you can see, it's open to federally recognized tribes and tribal governments, 501c3s, public university colleges, or state and local governments. All right, and on to the next one. And this is the Underrepresented Communities Grants Program through the National Park Service. This has been used by a lot of states. It's been around, it's coming up on a decade now. I think it's about 8 years that this has been around, that it's being used to find out properties from any underrepresented community out there. This does not require a match, but match might help. Grants can be up for $50,000. As you can see, eligible applicants are state governments, certified local governments, and federally recognized tribes. It is, we've gotten them in Arizona before on a couple of occasions. I know in LGBTQ area, the state of New York has been doing a multi-phased project on researching properties there that is using this grant regularly. And I believe there's been others too, but New York's the only one I know of for certain. And lastly, move on to the next slide, is our own Arizona Heritage Fund. Now, the previous two were federal grants, so the competition is nationwide. This and the Arizona Heritage Fund is just here in Arizona. Now, the original Arizona Heritage Fund lasted from 1992 to 2008, when the Great Recession caused the funds to be swept. And we struggled to get it back for many years. And in 2019, it was restored, but without funding. In the 2021 legislative session, funding for a single year was approved. And we are currently taking applications for that. There were 3 rounds that were set up, one November 1st, one February 1st, and one May 1st. We received 2 applications on November 1st, 2 completed applications on November 1st. And we're hoping to have about 6 more, it looks like, on February 1st. And that may be it. There may be no money after that. But you can see state, local, tribal governments, nonprofits, public education institutions are eligible. It can be done for rehabilitation, planning, survey and inventory, National Register nominations. This is the only bricks and mortar grant out there of the 3 that we're talking about. So this is the only one that would allow building rehab, for example. The other 2 are considered non-bricks and mortar grants. This grant can be up to $300,000 or as little as $5,000. It's got a big focus on public benefit. So how does it benefit the public? And being as this history is completely unknown for the most part here in Arizona, doing something like this should be easy to get the public benefit portion, since it would benefit the public to know about all of this. And that's really about it for this presentation. There's a couple of other grants that have come up, one of which is already passed, and I'm not sure that's going to be refunded, so we opted not to talk about it today. As you can see in the chat, Paul Lusignan has put in links to the NPS grant that's there. So with that, I will turn this back over to Marshall.
Wow. You know, I hope everyone's wheels are turning. I know mine sure are, about kind of opportunities. This has been such a great seminar. We open it up, actually, if all the panelists can turn their cameras on, because now we're going to ask for questions from those folks who are watching to see what else, if there's further questions. I know one of the things that I'm kind of struck by is, how does technology, I mean, as it's growing and changing how we interact with spaces, how does technology impact preserving LGBTQ spaces and stories? And I'm throwing that out to the crowd. So whoever would like to answer that.
Well, I guess I can start. So one of the ways technology has definitely helped in preserving our history, we've been doing or been showcasing virtual exhibits. I actually didn't show the slide, that slide please, but we did an exhibit for Miss P talking about the life of Paul Wigman and the transition, because obviously a lot of people have this idea that drag queens are just drag queens, but the older school drag queens have instilled in me that, no, I'm a man dressing as a woman, I'm impersonating as a woman. So obviously there's that age or generational difference. But using social media as well. So we've been using Facebook as a means of crowdsourcing, connecting with people, Instagram as well. We've been showcasing a lot of things that we're finding on the archives on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So luckily, because of those avenues that we've been taking, we've been getting a lot of feedback as well. So a lot of volunteers are coming in, a lot of people who are interested in our history. So I think those are the ways that technology has helped us over here in Florida or Orlando.
That's definitely true in Phoenix as well. The ways in which posting on social media. So Marshall, correct me if I'm wrong, but the bar project of generating that list of bars, there was also an effort via Facebook to ask people about their memories of what they remembered. And that's really helpful in a city like Phoenix, where you have people who are moving here, but also moving away pretty frequently to help recover maybe community knowledge that has since moved away from Phoenix. People can check back in and say, oh, I have this memory of this particular location. So that's been really tremendous. I'm also super excited about different technologies like Clio as well, or kind of virtual tour opportunities, because that allows folks who want to know more to have that information at their fingertips. So being able to go into a neighborhood and maybe you can't see that history right away, but being able to pull up an app and immediately find it, that's very exciting for me as well, about the accessibility of that information.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. It's like doing with the Clio, we did kind of a walking tour of Roosevelt. Recently been chatting about possibly doing maybe some geolocation tours, so that aren't based on a QR code or something else that a business has to sponsor as businesses change. Recently, next to the 307 was a restaurant called The Dressing Room, because that space was originally the dressing room for the drag queens that were performing at the 307. That restaurant has since closed, and now there's a new place in there that has basically cleaned all that history out. So trying to figure out, well, how do we now make that accessible? And Shane, you know, so at the beginning of the pandemic, I went on a virtual theatrical tour of spots across San Francisco that was done by a local theater troupe. That was really phenomenal. So I'm kind of intrigued by just the different ways that I think the pandemic has pushed social media into how do we understand spaces. I mean, the fact that anybody from anywhere could learn more about San Francisco and its history.
Yeah, I just want to quickly mention a project we're doing with SciArc. It's a nonprofit based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they travel around the world documenting historic sites using 3D technology that I don't totally understand, but they got a grant from a partner to document the Lion Martin House in San Francisco for us.
Wow.
For free. And so they, in September, we got access to the site, and they have created, you know, like a cloud and of the house and the property using aerial or drone technology, but also LiDAR scanning and all of that sort of thing. But it's going to be packaged in February. We're going to hopefully release it on Valentine's Day as a tribute to Dell and Phyllis. They were married in 2004 on Valentine's Day. And so anyway, but the kind of the cool thing is it'll give people access to the site who can't access it. It's a private site now. It's not accessible to the public. It's up a very long series of rickety steps, so it's not ADA accessible. So we're hoping that this kind of, it'll give a tour through the house using video, but also the daughter of Dell and Phyllis she was interviewed, and so she'll narrate the walking through the house, like this space was used for this. We also have interviewed queer historian Susan Stryker. She is, she'll talk about like the, international significance of Del and Phyllis and like what this house meant for their activism. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I think it also might become a Google experience, whatever that is. I know that they do a lot of work with Google Arts and Culture. So I'm kind of excited, and it's all very digital and beyond my scope, but I think it's an interesting way to bring together history and place-based history and queer historians and make it accessible online to everyone. So we'll see. I think it could be kind of cool.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
And I'd like to jump in and just make a comment, because when you asked the question about technology, I was kind of my first thought was thinking about how ephemeral these digital spaces can be. So it's great to hear from the three of you that there's these digital archives, and of course in my presentation I talked about using these archives, but I think a lot about if anybody who is in older millennial and above, you might remember GeoCities and Angel Fire and this kind of like late 90s, early 2000s generation of personal websites before we kind of had the platforms as the dominant way that we got online. And I think about this a lot because I had a lot of websites when I was younger on GeoCities, and I think around 2006 or 7, they erased the entire database, just hundreds of thousands of pages, and there's been some initiatives to kind of preserve some of those. And if you go on to the the Internet archive. Yeah, there's some of those pages are recorded, but I just kind of sometimes think, and I get really sad to think about that kind of specific period of queer history that was lost, of queer folks being online as kind of, and this early period of us being online and showing our stories and our narratives. So I just, I don't know, but I hope that there are being measures in all of these kind of archiving process being made to make sure that there is kind of backups or stability of these kind of archives so that they can continue being present online.
All right, we have our next question, which is, preservation has focused its attention on underrepresented communities, and this has become a catch-all term that includes women's history and history of ethnic groups. How do you all feel about that LGBTQ history falls into this paradigm? Well, I think, go ahead, Shane.
Well, no, who's going to jump in? I don't want to take it. I'm happy to speak up. So, yeah, at least for the San Francisco Historic Context Statement, we were really, really, really careful to not be siloed with all of these different layers of, within queer community, there are sub-communities of sub-communities of sub-communities. And every single one of those communities deserves to have their history told and some sort of representation in the history books. So I would say, it's kind of dangerous to throw us all under the catch-all underrepresented minority community, because there's so many other communities that fall under that. I don't know, for me, it just means we just have to keep working really hard. Keep telling these stories, especially for the people who just have not been able to have their stories told in the past, the non-white gay male stories.
All right, so with that, are there additional challenges aside from awareness and funding? Are the issues the same?
I would say there's tons of opportunity for funding queer history projects right now. If I'm just frank, where everyone seems to be scurrying after the summer of 2020 to show how inclusive they are. But that also means that comes with money, and we can't do any of these projects without funding. And so I would just say to everyone listening, take advantage of those opportunities, especially these, the grant opportunities for underrepresented minority communities. It's just sort of made for us. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, Marshall, this is Jim. Yeah, Eric would be a great resource to talk about the the technical aspects of the Heritage Fund. But if anyone needs some advice on the advocacy of grants, not only in Arizona but nationwide, Arizona Preservation Foundation works with other groups in other states and in Washington about ways to kind of figure out what's the best way to go for those grants.
Yeah, and I should emphasize that while I am currently the person best qualified to talk about it, we just lost our grant administrator who was supposed to be doing this presentation, and we're in the process of hiring a new one. So at the moment, I'm the best, but soon it will be somebody else.
Thanks, Eric.
Very good. Thank you, Eric, for that. Let's see. All right. So education is integral to raise awareness and increase engagement anywhere. What kind of programming for all ages have you found the most helpful in engaging the public? And what sort of public do you wish were available to share with the public in these spaces to connect their context with a historical one?
I think that there are some really tremendous, and they've been mentioned so far today, public history resources. Marshall, you're affiliated with a lot of them, a lot of those efforts, but something like History Happy Hour as well, which my mother happens to be a huge fan of. So you can see kind of this growing connection of maybe somebody who wouldn't have been introduced to this history becomes more familiar with it. And that is very accessible to people of different backgrounds or different familiarity. That's kind of the brilliance of this relationship between public history and popular history projects. In terms of materials that I think are really tremendous, I'm again, as I've mentioned, a huge fan of these digital mapping efforts and these digital projects. But I certainly think they can expand a bit in Phoenix. So for example, the History Pin website has different collections in cities of pinned locations that are of important relevance. In the entire state of Arizona, there's currently only one pinned location. So, and it's not the 307 plaque, it's Casa de Roma. So by creating these opportunities, and that's really awesome too, because it's an opportunity for people who maybe want to be more involved in the archival process or with a particular community organization, creating opportunities where people can contribute to creating that timeline and see their work translate into these public resources that then are incredibly accessible to wider public audiences. That's really tremendous. And that's something that has a great deal of staying power, whether you're working with high school students who want to know a little bit more about local LGBTQ history near them, or you're working with a group of scholars who have maybe done a lot of work in one place, but they're looking at a new location. Those are really tremendous resources.
Well, and it's interesting, I think, in being in this virtual realm, we have a storytelling project that is funded through Phoenix Office of Arts and Culture. And initially, it was really trying to focus on trying to get African-American LGBTQ stories unique to Phoenix or Arizona. And throwing off notes to people saying, hey, how do we get young Black men who are already engaged with each other in terms of pre-COVID, they were going to organize meetings and talking about things. How do we get them to attend? And the first response was food and beverage. And I was like, well, it's virtual. And then there was a long pause. So, I mean, it's like, in some ways, I think technology is helping us, but it's also that face-to-face where we could offer other things that would entice folks. So many people don't realize that their history, no matter how recent, is valuable. And I think that's a big thing getting folks to realize is that even that place, that little coffee shop that was there last week may not be there in 2 weeks, and that it may be important that it was there.
Yeah,
Okay. No, go ahead, Carolyn.
no, I was going to say certainly that's part of this conversation too, is thinking about what do we memorialize and preserve and why, and being really thoughtful about that. I think that's an element of the 307 story that's very interesting to me, is how it's preserved and when and why and what language we use to describe it, and how that's a valuable starting place, but also to kind of circle back to a question that was asked a while ago, but also how to complicate that discussion further. So there are all these different issues about, right? It's kind of these two things that are happening at once. First, we have to have this discussion about preserving sites and spaces that may be at risk right now. So I know that there was also this conversation about Melrose or the Coronado districts and what development is still doing. But also, so thinking of these as important and worthwhile, and how do we protect them in present? And then also how and what is the purpose of our kind of references to the sites that have already been lost, and how do those two things interact with one another?
Right. For me, that was kind of the dichotomy of this was, if we no longer have the space, how do we now preserve those stories? Because just because it's now just a plot of land, that's still valuable as a way to communicate. This was once here. It's not here now. So Alexis, how is Orlando handling kind of, you talked a little about it with Parliament House. I'm sure that there are other bars that have been lost that had unique histories. How are you all kind of finding those stories, and then also preserving them and trying to share them?
Yeah, so when COVID happened, we had originally scheduled an oral history interview with Miss Sammy, a drag performer. And within the week that we were supposed to meet this performer, he passed away. So we realized that we needed to speed up the process, So we took the COVID precautions and everything else, but we really kind of just, when my partner and I, we just went in doing oral histories with people. And so in the museum's part, we're doing that with oral histories, but interestingly enough, with Parliament House closing, the patrons of Parliament House created a whole entire Facebook page dedicated to all the memories, all the stories, everything regarding Parliament House. So we're trying to now work with, I guess, the people who created that group to see if we can at least take some of the photos, or at least have them in archives on our side, and pretty much kind of collect the histories. But the main thing that we're doing now at the moment is the oral histories, and just capturing all the narratives, all the stories from Parliament House. With that being said, though, for example, like the Diamond Head, one of the first gay bars or first gay clubs in Central Florida, is like, there's seldom information about that. And the ones who knew about it recently passed away. So it's like this time crunch of like, okay, well, we have so much people or so much manpower we have versus the amount of people that are passing away due to old age and everything else, or health reasons. So I think in Central Florida, it's the people themselves, which is great. It's not an institutional effort, but rather it's kind of like a teamwork in a way. The community, the museum with the people themselves.
Thank you. And Marcus, so one of the questions that I think always comes up when doing kind of this bit, which you got into a little bit, is sex and how that sanitization or that removal, because people feel that it's not worthy to be chatted about. So I guess that's a question for y'all, is how does that topic of sex play into also preserving these LGBTQ stories and spaces?
Sure. And I think for in my research, and I touched on this at the end, because the kind of sex component is something I talk about in a book chapter I have coming, where I kind of think about why specifically this person, Augustus Granville Deal, has been ignored or forgotten, whatever terminology you want to use. And kind of in that, I actually kind of argue that whereas at a time I thought it might be queer phobia is the reason why he has been kind of lost to history, but upon further thought and just kind of thinking about it, and as I touched on in the presentation today, it seems like there's kind of like this tension between what we know about mostly has to do with his sex, right? Around the arrest that he had in the gay sex sting in 1928. But then at the same time, that's this kind of sensualization of his story, but then at the same time, it's kind of like the end of the story. So I think it's this interesting thing where that is kind of this thing that we focus on, but I think we focus on it and we highlight that because that is kind of like the sensational, the deviant. I think Carolyn spoke about this a little bit too, and I really appreciated that as kind of a connection between the work, is that when we when some people, I think necessarily this group is guilty of this, but I think oftentimes when people from different standpoints do this kind of work and come across these people, it's like the sex thing is the sensational thing, and this is kind of what the one thing that we know about these historical figures. So in a sense, I think there is utility of sex, and it in kind of getting these names to ping for people. And as I mentioned, kind of how he was introduced to me was just a very short, he was gay, he had sex, and then I kind of took that and ran with it. And I think that's kind of the importance of having a diverse range of historians and scholars, not only from different fields, but different personal standpoints, who then can take that and then expand upon those stories. So again, it's problematic that is kind of sensationalized, but it's a starting point for further inquiry, I think.
Yeah, I would just jump in on the topic of sex and say that in our work in San Francisco, we didn't shy away from it at all. And in fact, I'm also remembering a conversation we had at the Scholars Roundtable for the National Park Service theme study in DC, where a colleague named Gerard Koskovich really hit the point home for everyone that this theme study can't sanitize sex, especially for the queer history in any way, because sex is so intertwined throughout our history, especially the policing of spaces because of sex and sodomy laws. And so it's kind of cool that the theme study didn't really steer clear of there and really even kind of dove into spaces like things we don't really, or other people don't really want to talk about, like sex dungeons and sex clubs and bathhouses, the things that are just another part of our history, but aren't exactly like fun for the whole family. But yeah, and we actually have, I worked on an evaluation for a building in San Francisco that was a historic bathhouse, originally early 1900s public utility bathhouse, not gay, but of course a lot of them did become gay over time. But we identified that as, it's already landmark, but we identified it as a potential landmark in addition for its queer sex history, because it was one of dozens of sites in San Francisco shut down by the Department of Public Health in the 80s when the bathhouse closed, sex crazed bathhouse closures, AIDS, all of the fears surrounding that. So yeah, it's just another chapter in our history, and it's important.
Well, and Shane, I think you make also an important point, not with just sex, but a building that may already be designated, but the LGBTQ factor has been kind of left out. I know I've been recently having chats with museums about works of art that are done by artists that nowhere in their bio does it say that they are LGBTQ. And so at what point do you say, okay, this is an LGBT artist, they've been in a long committed relationship or whatever? That aspect of identification. I mean, we got a little bit into it of using the word queer for someone who may not have been able to be called LGBTQ back in the day. Like when I refer to Nikolai, it's always calling him a gender pioneer because I don't know how he would have identified. Those terms didn't exist. And so I think in some ways, I think that identification of looking at a space or a story and trying to attach labels to it. How do you all kind of see that moving forward? I think as language keeps getting more and more refined and just kind of as it's also changing.
I mean, I think carefully, thoughtfully, being willing to continue to consider it. Nikolai Duralyn is actually a really interesting example because in gay American history, the kind of section on Nikolai Duralyn is actually, and that was 1976, is in the lesbian history section as a particular type of violence conflating cross-dressing with sexual orientation. And so there's been a great deal of theoretical writings about the ways in which historians have interpreted both gender and sexuality in not always great ways and sometimes particularly historically violent ways. And I think the great part of those theoretical contributions is it certainly provided a lot of thought about how to be very careful about describing identity. So it's not really a direct solution to your question,
right.
But I think we have a lot of really tremendous literature out there that gives us a lot of guideline and thought about how to be very careful in these conversations, which is certainly a tremendous move forward for the literature base.
All right, then I think in closing, we have our last question. And that's, so speaking of arts and culture, there are other funding opportunities through local, state, national arts agencies and humanities organizations. What other organizations other than like National Park Service have you all kind of seen or considered? It's like these folks would be willing to fund some of the, because as you said, Shane, without some of this, I mean, without money, a lot of this will never happen.
Yeah, so going back to the Lion Martin House was just this most recent example. Is we're trying to buy it. The new owner is willing to sell it back to the community, and so we are very much looking at different sources of funding. And we initially were all thinking in the preservation box. Of course, we're thinking about the trust and the National Park Service, but because we're so grassroots and so community based and teamed with the Lgbt Historical Society, we've decided to take kind of a more like activist approach or a radical approach and team with, for example, the Curve Foundation. I don't know if everyone's aware of them, legendary lesbian magazine called Curve that is, it's no longer in print, but it was recently repurchased by the original founders. And so now the Curve Foundation is, it's just this really wonderful group that wants to fund things exactly like the Lion Martin House. And another organization that we're looking toward is I think it's called the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice. I know that's not it, but so yeah, I think just as my partners and I are trying to figure out how to do this, we have found that there are so many other people to partner with who are eager to work on these kinds of community-based public history projects who aren't the traditional, the National Trust, that sort of thing.
I know here in Arizona, we have the Arizona Community Foundation, which is a kind of an over umbrella for a lot of different organizations that basically fund different projects. And within that, there's the Tapestry, which is LGBTQ focused. In the last few years, it's like every time I've reached out, they're like, well, there's really nothing. So hopefully maybe now with this current kind of spark in terms of, I think really, like as you said, during this pandemic, it's like people have suddenly become more aware that there needs to be preservation of these stories, of these places, of our community history. And so maybe some of those organizations that in the past haven't necessarily had a lot to do with it will be going back down those routes again.
So
Yeah. Oh,
no, go ahead.
oh, just quickly, I was going to say, yeah, I think it's critical for us to continue to partner with queer organizations. That's what I've learned the most out of my work in San Francisco is partnering with the GLBT Historical Society and acknowledging the work that these queer community historians have been doing to just document their own history since the 80s. It's like, you know, these people have been working so hard to document our history for us. And I don't want to get too far separated from those roots because a lot of those people are still there. They're starting to retire and age out, but yeah, keep it queer, keep it local. That's what I think.
Yeah, one of the points I was going to mention in comparison to like the Parma House, we have the whole, obviously the whole Hulse nightclub. We're not really working with the One Pulse Foundation. We're doing our thing. We are assisting them whenever they need assistance. But from what I can remember, I know that they're trying to build a memorial or make the complex into a memorial. But there's also controversy with that because there are some people who are family members or people who were part of it who have a negative connotation to the foundation because of various reasons, bureaucracy, politics, whatever. With that being said, I think that's one of the attempts that we're doing here in Orlando. I can't speak for them because we're doing our own separate thing, but I do know that the One Pulse Foundation is trying to at least create a memorial to preserve the memory of the 49 victims and also to create a community outreach. I know that they were planning to do some education programs. They had this model of like 3 or 4 story museum for that area, focusing on just community outreach and everything else. So I think, so there are some attempts, but to be honest, we're not really seeing a lot happening in Orlando. We're here, we're queer, but we're not really doing anything. So it's kind of interesting.
All right, does anyone have anything lastly to add before we wrap up and adjourn this amazing seminar?
Yeah, I actually have a question to the historians on the panel that Alexis just made me think of that this is something I've spoken to about with my mentors and colleagues in sociology and haven't really gotten any clear answers on or best practices because it's not necessarily something that we do, but I figured we have some time, so I would ask. So one of the things that that kind of developed as I was going through this research process and starting to publish on this work, on this person, that I didn't think of early on in the process until work started coming out. I was like, oh, wow, he didn't have any children, but I know he has relatives who are alive today. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that, just in terms of like, do these people know about this history? Would they want to know? Is this something that they would even want out there? So I don't know if that's a specific question, but I just wonder if that's anything anybody else on the panel doing this kind of work has run into and kind of how you've thought about that and reckoned with that kind of the ancestors of the progeny of these people, these historical figures that you're writing about and bringing into the public.
What a phenomenal question. Um, Similarly, I have a great concern about what is historical outing. So if someone in their life is not out and after their death, so Nikolai Duralyn again is a great example. In death, his identity is revealed, it's sensationalized. And kind of what is the ethical obligation then I have as a historian to tell that story? And then I think there's this whole other level of when you're dealing with people who are still living or have relatives as well, like what is the ethical and thoughtful way that you approach that history? And for me, I'm still in the process of knowing what the right thing is to do, but centering that thought and that care and thinking, well, if I have a worry about it, maybe I'll talk to my committee or ask around, but I think if it's starting with a place of like, I want to be the most respectful possible, that's a great place to start because it certainly hasn't been that way always. So yeah, I think that's a really tough conversation, but a very valuable one.
And yeah, I want to thank you, Marcus, for that question as well. That's kind of what I was trying to hint at in the slew of questions I barraged Marshall with, is that there are some really, in my opinion, some really unique challenges to not just telling the story of lesbian, bisexual, gay, trans folks, but also preserving. And one of those is sort of the divide between what is considered public versus personal. And as many of you brought out, some of it also involves the idea that sexuality or sex in general is a taboo subject. And I think that there is this fear of and I wouldn't say it's necessarily within the LGBTQ community, but a fear just maybe in the preservation community of essentially taking our movement a bit too far by discussing what people do in their bedrooms, or even hinting that people do different things in their bedrooms, or even in public or in public places. I think that there's a stigma there that we need to overcome and address, because sexuality, I mean, we can be kind and talk about just identity and community, but really, as Shane, as you brought out, some of these properties are properties where there were sex workers or folks engaged in sexual acts, and those are histories that need to be told as well. And again, just to wrap us up, because I think we are at that mark, I want to thank all of you. Marshall and Carolyn, you guys are doing the work right now for Arizona and Phoenix, and the work, Marshall, that you've done with Nikolai. I'm gonna kill his last name here. Duralyn. Duralyn. Thank you. Is foundational. It's groundbreaking. But when all is said and done, we have a grave. And I know we have some folks here who are actually they're with the National Register office in DC. And, generally speaking, we as preservationists, we don't want to list graves, because people have lives and they are known for what they do in their productive life, not for just the fact that they're dead. So there's this kind of a sadness there that we can only tell that story by visiting a grave. And then Carolyn, you are telling the story of the 307 Lounge. A great story. And actually, I was on the City of Phoenix Historic Preservation Commission when the designation of the lounge was sort of brought up as a possibility during its proposed demolition. What we have left of the 307 Lounge is a plaque, which, the plaque is sort of the, it is the black mark of preservation. It is what is left behind when we've failed in our efforts to actually preserve tangible history. So I think we're there. You guys are telling those stories. And I can tell you, as where I sit here from the, as a historian, as a preservationist, as a humanist, and as the State Historic Preservation Officer, I want to see more of that. I would love to see more of the stories told where we can actively point to places on the map that are still existing and say, hey, these are the places that are important to the gay community, to the lesbian community, and again, Shane, you brought up a really good notion of like, well, do we drill down and do we start, really getting into what is gay versus what is queer, what is trans versus, or are we better served by looking at a broader lens? Do we start our efforts in urban areas where we know at least maybe our documentation is stronger over, finding queer spaces, gay spaces, or do we do a big statewide context? Do we go very sort of ambitious? So those are questions that I grapple with just as a paper pusher and administrator. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Shane, Seth, Marcus, Alexis, all of you guys who are showing us that this work is being done across the country. And that we really need to have more of these conversations so that I don't think we're going to ever duplicate an effort here. But I think there's so much to learn by what people are doing with story maps and just how the history is collected. This discussion has got me wondering if we are able to create, since we have this challenge of privacy and a challenge of documentation where we're going to find coded documentation in newspapers about, places that men, strange men would frequent in the 60s and 70s. And what is that? What is that code? Since we're dealing with a subject matter that's not going to lend itself to reliable historical documentation, how do we collect that information? I would argue that there's a dire need that if we don't start collecting this information right away, we're going to lose it. So do we just go and we do story maps and we crowdsource the history? I don't know where we go with that, but there's so much to be done. And I think that the problem of LGBTQ history is going to challenge us in ways that preservation has not been challenged before. Our challenge is to step up to the plate and not run away from it. So I am going to pledge additional resources to this. I think Shane, you're right. The funding is there. The time is right. And preservation has to look outside of its traditional funding sources and really create bridges with all sorts of progressive causes and organizations that deal with LGBTQ issues. Because if, as preservationists will tell you, if we don't know our past, we can't move forward into the future. Even if parts of our past are troublesome and really shameful in the way we've treated others, we really need to get those out and known. So with that, I will say we have recorded today's sessions. And I hope all of you will share these within your network and say, hey, I took a couple hours out of my Tuesday and heard some really engaging talks. And also, Donna wanted me to remind folks that on APF's website, they're going to be compiling a list of resources, some of which were shared in the links, but those get buried in recordings. So there will be a list of resources for doing this work. And then I look forward to following all of you in what you're doing in your respective states. And in the case of Carolyn and Marshall, cultivating what y'all are doing here in Arizona. And we're going to be, oh gosh, it's so hard with when we get our grant staff back, we're going to be pushing forward in the next year or so with trying to figure out how SHPO can support at least the identification phase, a survey and a context, so that we can get a better handle on LGBTQ history here in Arizona. So again, I wanted to thank everyone. I learned so much today. I still don't know what the 2+ is, Marshall. I don't know what's going on there. Who did that? Was that you?
So that is Two-Spirit.
Two-Spirit.
Which is a Native American term that's a fairly new term.
Oh, like Berdache.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, but that is now a verboten word because of all the negative connotations of it. So no, exactly. So that's so now you have Two-Spirit, which is kind of
Two-Spirit.
Those folks living, I mean, even historically.
Okay, well, see there, I just took that away in the last 30 seconds. And so hopefully you've all taken away so much more. Thank you again for spending time with us. Thank you, APF, and thank you to all of the folks that helped organize. Thank you, Marshall, and all of our panelists for hanging with us today. Look forward to seeing your work.